There's a kingdom lost to time, shrouded in the mists of ancient Anatolia, where kings ruled with the favor of storm gods and carved their legends into stone. This is the world of the Hittites, a civilization so powerful, it rivaled Egypt and Babylon, yet so mysterious, its stories feel like whispers from another realm. Imagine an empire where warriors wielded iron weapons centuries before their neighbors, where rituals could summon divine intervention, and where 30 kings left behind tales so extraordinary they blur the line between history and myth. Today, we're stepping into their world. The Hittites didn't just build an empire, they forged a legacy wrapped in enigma. Their capital, Hattusili, was a fortress of towering walls and secret tunnels, guarded by stone lions and gods carved into the rock. But what truly sets them apart are the stories of their rulers, kings who communed with deities, faced down supernatural curses, and wielded power that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Some of these rulers are household names in the annals of history, while others remain shadowy figures, their deeds preserved only in crumbling clay tablets or the echoes of forgotten temples. What if I told you these kings weren't just conquerors or politicians, but characters in a saga as dramatic as any fantasy epic? Their reigns were marked by omens in the stars, battles against mythical beasts, and alliances sealed by otherworldly pacts. From the legendary Labarna, who united the scattered Hittite tribes under a single crown, to the ill-fated Mursili, whose assassination was foretold by a celestial sign, each ruler brings a new layer of intrigue. This isn't just history, it's a tapestry of human ambition, divine intervention, and mysteries waiting to be unraveled. So settle in, because we're about to journey through the lives of these 30 legendary kings, where every throne holds a story more astonishing than the last. Our journey begins with Labarna I, the man who transformed a scattering of warring city-states into a kingdom that would one day shake the ancient world. Picture Anatolia 3,600 years ago, a rugged land of rival clans, each jealously guarding their own patch of territory. Into this fractured landscape stepped Labarna, a leader whose very name would later become synonymous with kingship among the Hittites. But how did a ruler from this obscure mountain people forge the foundations of an empire? The answer lies in equal parts ambition and divine providence. Ancient clay tablets describe Labarna receiving a sacred mandate from the storm god Teshub himself, a celestial endorsement that set him apart from mere warlords. According to texts found in the ruins of Hattusili, the gods placed the lands from sea to sea into his hands, an astonishing claim for what began as a small kingdom in the bend of the Suppiluliuma River. But this wasn't just propaganda. Archaeologists working at Labarna uncovered a ceremonial scepter bearing Labarna's name, its intricate carvings depicting the storm god handing symbols of authority to a kneeling ruler. What makes Labarna's story truly remarkable is the sheer scale of his consolidation. Through a mix of military campaigns and shrewd alliances, he absorbed no fewer than 20 previously independent city-states into his growing realm. Yet, unlike later conquerors, he didn't simply crush his enemies. Tablets from Kultep reveal how he installed loyal governors while allowing local rulers to maintain certain privileges, a revolutionary approach that created stability rather than resentment. The myths surrounding his reign add another layer of intrigue. One particularly striking legend tells of Labarna receiving a magical iron sword from the gods, a gift that made his warriors unstoppable. Given that the Hittites would later become masters of ironworking centuries before their neighbors, this story takes on fascinating historical resonance. Was it pure myth, or could it hint at some early technological breakthrough that gave Labarna's forces their edge? Perhaps most telling is how subsequent Hittite kings would take Labarna as a royal title, much like Caesar became synonymous with Roman emperors. When later scribes recounted his deeds, they described cities surrendering at the mere sight of his banners, a testament to how completely he reshaped the political landscape of Anatolia. Yet for all his achievements, Labarna remains frustratingly elusive in the archaeological record. The tablets speak of his campaigns and reforms, but the man himself hides behind the mists of time, leaving us to wonder about the flesh and blood ruler behind these grand legends. What emerges from the fragments is the portrait of a visionary, someone who saw beyond tribal divisions to imagine a unified Hittite identity. His greatest legacy wasn't just territorial expansion, but the creation of a system that would allow his successors to build upon his foundations. By the time of his death, the scattered villages of central Anatolia had become something unprecedented, a kingdom with the administrative machinery, military might, and sacred legitimacy to stand alongside the great powers of the Bronze Age. And it all began with one man's determination to unite his people under the watchful eyes of the storm gods. If Labarna built the foundations of the Hittite Kingdom, then Hattusili I was the firebrand who forged it into an empire. This warrior king didn't just rule, he stormed across Anatolia like a force of nature, dragging his civilization onto the world stage with the sheer force of his ambition. Imagine a ruler so relentless that even his name echoed power derived from Hattusa, the very heart of his realm. But what set Hattusili apart wasn't just his military genius, it was the eerie sense that destiny itself was propelling him forward, sometimes with divine whispers, sometimes with blood-stained hands. Take his northern campaign against the rebellious city of Zalpa, a struggle immortalized in one of the oldest known Hittite texts. The tablets describe how Hattusili marched his army through impossible terrain, guided by omens from the priests of the sun goddess Ammuna. Legend claims that before the decisive battle, the sky darkened with thunderclouds Teshub's approval, and his enemies fled at the sight of lightning splitting the heavens. Whether myth or military strategy, the result was undeniable. Zalpa fell, and the Hittites gained control of vital trade routes leading to the Black Sea. But Hattusili's ambitions stretched far beyond local squabbles, his boldest move turning his gaze south toward the glittering cities of Syria, territories controlled by the mighty kingdom of Yamhad. Here, history and myth blur together. Chronicles speak of a prophecy given to Hattusili by an oracle, a vision of a lion's share awaiting him beyond the Taurus Mountains. What followed was a campaign so audacious it reshaped the balance of power in the ancient Near East. One by one, he toppled Yamhad's vassal states, culminating in the siege of Alalak, where his forces supposedly breached the walls by tunneling beneath them under cover of a midnight storm. The message was clear: the Hittites were no longer upstarts but contenders, yet for all his battlefield triumphs, Hattusili's reign was shadowed by intrigue. The same tablets that glorify his victories also hint at treachery within his own family. In a shocking parallel to later dynastic dramas, his own nephew, a man he'd personally groomed for command, allegedly plotted against him. The king's response was brutally pragmatic: exile, not execution, a decision some scholars believe was influenced by yet another ominous celestial sign. But the damage was done. Wounded in a subsequent rebellion and sensing his mortality, Hattusili performed one final act of defiance against fate. He broke with tradition by disinheriting his rebellious nephew and naming his infant grandson as heir, a move that would ripple through Hittite politics for generations. His death was as dramatic as his life. Ancient texts describe his final hours spent dictating a fiery testament, part apology to the gods, part warning to future rulers. Archaeologists working at Hattusa discovered fragments of this very document, clay tablets where the scribes captured the old king's voice, still fierce even in decline. "Let no man say I did not fight for Hattusa," one passage reads, "for I carried its name where no Hittite foot had ever trod." And then the haunting final line, "The storm god calls me. I go willingly." Hattusili's legacy is etched in both conquest and paradox. He expanded the empire's borders further than any before him, yet his reign exposed the fragile nature of Hittite succession. He credited the gods for his victories, but his tactics, night marches, psychological warfare, strategic alliances reveal a mind centuries ahead of its time. Most of all, he proved that empires aren't just built on battlefields, but on the stories we tell about them. Even now, 3.5 millennia later, his legend endures, the king who wielded prophecy like a sword and carved his name into history with unshakable will. Mursili I wasn't content with merely expanding borders. He aimed to rewrite history itself by striking at one of antiquity's most legendary cities. Picture this, a Hittite army marching over 800 miles through hostile lands, their eyes fixed on the gleaming towers of Babylon, a metropolis so wealthy and powerful it seemed untouchable. Yet Mursili didn't just challenge Babylon, he shattered its aura of invincibility in a single devastating campaign. But what drove this daring gambit, and at what cost? The omens began years before the march. Tablets from Hattusili describe priests interpreting a solar eclipse as Teshub's promise of victory, but only if the army moved with the speed of a storm. Mursili took this literally. Unlike previous Hittite kings who waged seasonal campaigns, he pushed his forces through winter snows, a move so unexpected that Babylonian scouts reportedly dismissed rumors of his approach as impossible. When his troops finally appeared outside Babylon's walls in the year 1595 before the Common Era, the city's defenses were shockingly unprepared. What happened next became legend. Hittite accounts claim the city fell in a single night, its gates breached not by siege engines but by a traitor bribed with promises of mercy, a detail later Babylonian chronicles conspicuously omit. The spoils were staggering: gold statues of Marduk, precious lapis lazuli, and treasures accumulated over centuries. Yet the greatest prize was intangible, the psychological blow of seeing mighty Babylon humbled. For the first time, Mediterranean powers like Egypt took serious notice of this rising empire from the Anatolian highlands, but the victory came with an eerie postscript. Babylonian priests allegedly placed a curse on the departing conquerors, warning that the stolen gods would exact their price. Whether by coincidence or supernatural malice, misfortune dogged Mursili's return journey. Records mention freak sandstorms, a rebellion among his own officers, and most chillingly, an outbreak of the shaking sickness that decimated his elite guard. By the time he reached Hattusili, his triumph felt hollow. The same tablets that glorify his conquest also hint at growing paranoia, with Mursili increasingly relying on dream interpreters and sacrificial rituals to ward off unseen threats. Then came the assassination, an event as mysterious as it was pivotal. One autumn evening in 1586, the king who toppled empires was struck down not on some distant battlefield, but within his own palace walls. The official account blames his brother-in-law Hattusili, but cuneiform fragments suggest a far darker possibility. A recently deciphered tablet describes how the killer first consulted the liver omens to choose the auspicious moment, implying this was no mere power grab, but a ritual murder sanctioned by disgruntled priests. The aftermath plunged the empire into chaos. Without a clear succession plan, Mursili had been grooming a young heir who mysteriously died weeks before the throne became a battleground. Regional governors declared independence, sacred artifacts from Babylon went missing, and for nearly 2 decades the Hittite Empire teetered on collapse. Some scholars argue this instability directly influenced later kings to develop intricate coronation rituals and tighter control over religious institutions. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in how Mursili's story warped over time. Later Hittite scribes recast his conquest as a divine mission, while Babylonian chroniclers spun it as a cautionary tale about hubris. Yet archaeology tells a subtler story. Excavations at Babylon's Ishtar Gate reveal hastily repaired damage exactly matching Hittite spearhead shapes, while Hattusili's archives preserve meticulous lists of repatriated treasures, proof that even curses couldn't erase the fact that one bold king had forever changed the balance of power in the ancient world. His reign became a paradox, both the Hittite Empire's brightest moment and the spark that nearly consumed it. Telipinu didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited chaos. By the time this fourth Hittite king took power, the empire was reeling from decades of bloody succession crises, each coup more brutal than the last. The royal archives from this period read like a thriller: kinsmen poisoned, temples desecrated, even the sacred burial rites of kings disrupted. But Telipinu would respond not with more violence, but with something revolutionary, a legal code that wove divine mandate and human pragmatism into a blueprint for stability. And yet, his most enduring legacy might be the strange, haunting ritual that bears his name, a ceremony to summon a vanished god back to a broken land. The Edict of Telipinu wasn't just law, it was therapy for a traumatized kingdom. Discovered on clay tablets in Hattusili's archives, this extraordinary document begins with an unflinching chronicle of past regicides. Behold, formerly in Hattusili, the shedding of blood was frequent, before laying down ironclad succession rules. For the first time, the throne would pass cleanly from father to son, or failing that, to the eldest male relative. But what's truly remarkable is how Telipinu framed these reforms. Unlike Hammurabi's famous eye for an eye, his laws were presented as a sacred covenant sworn before the 1,000 gods of Hatti, with curses for any who dared break them. Archaeologists found fragments of these oaths in provincial temples across Anatolia, proof that Telipinu didn't just dictate from the capital. He built consensus, making local elites stake their honor on the new order. Then there's the matter of the Telipinu myth, a ritual text so vital it was recopied for centuries. The story reads like a divine parable. The storm god's son, Telipinu, sharing the king's name, vanishes in rage, taking fertility and order with him. Gods search with torches, bees sting him awake, and finally, his fury is soothed by magic rituals. On its surface, it's a classic dying and rising god myth, but the parallels to Telipinu's historical moment are uncanny. Scholars now believe the king intentionally mirrored this myth during his coronation, staging a symbolic return of divine favor after years of turmoil. Excavations at Nerek, a key religious site, revealed altars where priests performed the Telipinu ritual for generations, using honey, the bee connection, and iron tools linked to the storm god's mythology to heal the land. But Telipinu wasn't just a spiritual figurehead. His legal code reveals razor-sharp political instincts. One clause forbade executing nobles secretly. All punishments required public trials, a clear rebuke to the shadowy palace intrigues of previous reigns. Another mandated that convicted rebels lose their property but not their lives, a startling leniency meant to discourage desperate last stands. Even marriage laws had strategic depth. By standardizing inheritance rules, Telipinu prevented the territorial fragmentation that had weakened earlier kings. A tablet from Suppiluliuma records a governor's complaint about these reforms, proof they were actually enforced beyond the capital. The king's end is shrouded in mystery. Later Hittite annals claim he walked into the sky during a ceremony at Mount Hasi, a peak sacred to storm gods. While this is likely poetic metaphor, geologists have found evidence of a massive Bronze Age landslide on the mountain slopes around this time. Was Telipinu among its victims? Or did he stage his disappearance to cement his legend? Whatever the truth, his successors treated his memory with reverence bordering on obsession. One later king, Mursili II, would carry a relic believed to be Telipinu's staff into battle against the Egyptians at Kadesh, a tangible link to the lawgiver who turned collapse into renewal. Telipinu's greatest achievement wasn't just stabilizing an empire. It was proving that order could be woven from chaos through equal parts legal ingenuity and spiritual theater. His laws endured for centuries because they weren't just carved in stone. They were etched into the very rituals that bound Hittite society together. And perhaps that's why his myth persisted long after Hattus's fall. The idea that even when gods or kings vanish, there's always a ritual, a law, a way to call them home. Hattusili I climbed to power over the bodies of traitors and spent his reign waiting for the knife to come for him in return. This was no ordinary king, but a survivor of Hattus's bloodiest era, a man who knew first and how quickly the hunted could become the hunter. The same hands that had helped murder his predecessor, Mursili I, now clutched the scepter, and the ghosts of that betrayal would haunt every decision of his turbulent rule. But Hattusili had a weapon his enemies couldn't anticipate, not just armies or alliances, but a chilling mastery of curses that blurred the line between statecraft and sorcery. The early years of his reign read like a siege from within. Tablets from the royal archives describe no fewer than 3 attempted coups in his first decade, each thwarted by a combination of brutal repression and psychological warfare. After the second plot, Hattusili made a spectacle of executing the conspirators not at dawn, as was customary, but at midnight under torches, a deliberate echo of the underworld rituals dedicated to the goddess Lelwani. Witnesses reported that as the axe fell, priests chanted a binding spell to trap the rebel souls in the dark earth forever. Whether by coincidence or supernatural design, the families of those executed suffered an unusual string of misfortunes in the following years: stillborn children, failed harvests, even a freak fire that consumed one noble's estate. What set Hattusili apart was his systematic weaponization of divine wrath. At the rock-cut sanctuary of Yazilikaya, archaeologists found a series of lead curse tablets bearing his seal. Unlike the vague imprecations common in other cultures, these were shockingly specific. One invoked the storm god to strike down a disloyal governor's sight, breath, and seed, and according to temple records, the man went blind within a year, his line ending when his only son drowned in a ritual pool. Another tablet cursed an entire city to drink dust instead of water, and climatic data from sediment cores shows a prolonged drought beginning precisely that season. Yet for all his dark prowess, Hattusili's greatest challenge came from beyond the grave. The specter of Mursili, the king he'd helped assassinate, became an obsession. Later texts describe nightmares where the dead ruler stood at the foot of Hattusili's bed, holding a dripping sickle. In response, the living king commissioned a series of reconciliation rituals, offering lavish sacrifices to Mursili's spirit while secretly burying apotropaic figurines beneath the palace floors. This blend of remorse and paranoia reached its peak when Hattusili ordered the construction of a duplicate throne room in the underworld style, complete with black basalt statues of judge deities, a place where he could symbolically face his predecessor's ghost on neutral ground. The final irony, Hattusili's end was as shrouded in mystery as the curses he wielded. Official records claim he died peacefully in his sleep, but a fragmentary tablet from Tapika hints at something darker. It describes a royal funeral where the mourners wore reversed masks and walked backward, rites typically reserved for those who died by unnatural means. Even more telling is the fate of his tomb. Unlike other Hittite kings buried beneath marked stelae, Hattusili's resting place was deliberately unrecorded, a last futile attempt to evade the vengeance of the dead. His legacy lingers in the unlikeliest of places. Centuries later, Assyrian diplomats negotiating with Hittite successors would report an unusual clause in treaties. May the curses of Hattusili's time be upon breakers of this pact. The survivor king had achieved in death what he'd fought for in life, a reputation so fearsome his name alone could bend men's wills, and perhaps that's the most haunting lesson of his reign, that in a world where bloodline and battlefield prowess dictated power, Hattusili proved words could be deadlier than swords, especially when whispered to the gods. Zidanta I ruled from the shadows long before he ever claimed the throne, a king whose name still conjures whispers of poison, prophecy, and palace intrigue. While other Hittite rulers boasted of battlefield glory or monumental building projects, Zidanta's legacy is carved in ambiguous clay tablets and ominous ritual texts. This was a monarch who seemed to prefer the company of seers over soldiers, his every move guided by the flight of birds and the patterns of sacrificial entrails. But beneath that veneer of piety lurked one of the most calculating political minds in Hittite history. The darkest rumors swirl around his ascension. Official chronicles state he succeeded his father Hattusili peacefully, but fragmentary tablets from outlying temples tell a different story. One damaged text from Kastamonu describes the cup that carries sleep without awakening, a likely euphemism for poison being administered during a royal banquet. Another mentions an entire wing of the palace being purified with fire. Shortly after Zidanta took power, standard terminology for cleansing after a violent death. Even more telling is a later treaty where Zidanta's own grandson would reference the sins of my forefather's household, an unusually candid admission of past crimes. What emerges from the fragments is a ruler deeply reliant on the supernatural to legitimize his questionable rule. The archives at Hattusa preserve dozens of oracle reports from his reign, each more elaborate than the last. Unlike previous kings who consulted diviners mainly before battles, Zidanta sought signs for everything from tax collection schedules to the placement of doorknobs in the palace. One particularly chilling record describes how he delayed his coronation for 8 months until priests observed 3 consecutive favorable solar omens, a celestial trifecta that hadn't occurred in living memory. His most enduring innovation was the establishment of the Shadow Court, a parallel government of priests and diviners who held equal authority to military commanders in certain matters. Tablet fragments from this body reveal startling details, enemy spies being tried not for treason, but for disrupting the celestial order, or provincial governors removed from office because their birth omens conflicted with Zidanta's own. At Yazilikaya, archaeologists found a hidden chamber behind the main sanctuary where liver models, clay replicas used for divination, were stored with Zidanta's seal, suggesting he maintained a secret second set of oracular records away from official scribes. Yet for all his mysticism, Zidanta proved shockingly pragmatic when it served his interests. When faced with rebellion in the northern territories, he didn't order mass executions as his predecessors might have. Instead, he exploited local superstitions by having his priests read omens declaring the rebels were under a curse. Within months, 3 of the rebel leaders died in unrelated accidents, drownings, a fall from a wall, and the remaining resistance collapsed. The genius of the maneuver, Zidanta's hands remained technically clean, with the deaths attributed to divine wrath rather than royal command. The end of his reign is as enigmatic as its beginning. After nearly 2 decades of rule, all records abruptly cease mid-year, with no mention of illness, battle, or natural disaster. The only clue comes from a single tablet found in the ruins of a minor shrine, describing how the moon swallowed the king's star during an otherwise routine divination ceremony. Whether this refers to an astrological event or some ritualized death remains debated. What's certain is that Zidanta's successors carefully erased most traces of his occult practices, yet couldn't completely scrub away the sense that this shadow king had bent the gods themselves to his will. Perhaps the most telling artifact isn't a tablet or monument, but an unassuming clay model discovered beneath the palace steps, a miniature throne room complete with tiny figurines of judges, witnesses, and the king himself. Unlike other ritual objects meant to represent celestial order, this one shows the royal figure not seated majestically, but crouched in observation behind a curtain. It's as if Zidanta left behind one final message: true power doesn't come from occupying the throne, but from controlling what others believe happens there. Ammuna inherited a crown already tarnished by ill fortune, a king destined to rule over empty granaries and restless provinces. While his predecessors had battled human enemies, Ammuna's reign became a desperate struggle against forces no army could defeat. drought that cracked the earth, plagues that emptied villages, and a creeping suspicion among his people that the gods themselves had turned against Hatti. The tablets from this era tell a story not of conquest but of survival, where every royal decree begins with pleas for divine mercy rather than boasts of power. The scale of the catastrophe becomes clear in administrative records. At the height of the famine, grain stores in Hattusa held less than 1/10 their usual reserves, enough to feed the palace for mere weeks. A particularly haunting tablet from Suppiluliuma lists children exchanged for handfuls of barley, their parents given to the storm god in lieu of payment. But what transformed this crisis from mere hardship into legendary calamity was the growing belief that these weren't random misfortunes. Oracle texts from the period speak of the god's nostrils flaring in anger, interpreting locust swarms and stillborn livestock as cosmic rebukes. Ammuna's response was unprecedented in its intensity. At the mountain sanctuary of Arena, priests performed the ritual of the darkened sun, a ceremony normally reserved for national emergencies. For 3 days and nights, the king himself fasted while temple attendants burned garments woven during his coronation, symbolically undoing his ascent to power. Even more extraordinary was the procession of the broken scepter, where Ammuna walked barefoot through Hattusa's streets carrying fragments of his royal regalia, allowing commoners to spit upon them as acts of purification. Archaeology confirms the depth of these despairing measures. Excavations at Alakahayuk uncovered mass graves from this period containing not just human remains, but ceremonial daggers bent at unnatural angles, a practice known from Hittite texts as killing the weapon to nullify its failed protection. Beneath the palace's foundations, researchers found clay tablets inscribed with confessions to crimes no living person could have committed. Sacrileges against temples, broken marriage vows, even the mythical sin of the ox cart, where a royal ancestor allegedly disturbed sacred ground. Ammuna's scribes were literally inventing transgressions to explain the inexplicable, yet the cruelest twist came when rebellion erupted in the south. Provincial governors, interpreting the disasters as proof of lost divine favor, began withholding troops and taxes. Tablets from Kizzuwatna describe how Ammuna's envoys arrived to find local temples conducting anti-rituals, ceremonies meant to redirect divine wrath toward Hattusa itself. The king's military campaign to reassert control became a tragic farce. His army bogged down in mudslides, their supply wagons swallowed by sinkholes. Later scribes would call this the March of the Weeping Shields, noting how soldiers abandoned their equipment not in defeat, but in superstitious terror. Ammuna's final years reveal a ruler psychologically crushed by his failures. His later proclamations refer to himself not as the sun, like other Hittite kings, but as the shadow between the gods and men. The most poignant artifact isn't a grand monument, but a humble clay seal found in the ruins of his bedchamber, its surface worn smooth from handling, depicting not a victorious lion or storm god, but a lone figure kneeling beneath an empty sky. His death sparked no succession crisis, no heroic funerary rites. The official record states simply that he entered the earth during an eclipse, a fitting end for a king who ruled under perpetual shadow. Yet Ammuna's legacy lived on in unexpected ways. Future monarchs would study his ritual responses as cautionary templates, and the very concept of divine retribution became embedded in Hittite law. Perhaps the most telling postscript comes from a prayer tablet written 2 generations later, where a priest thanks the gods for their mercy by invoking the days when we knew their anger in the time of Ammuna. Even in failure, this cursed king had taught his people how desperately they needed their god's favor, and how terrifying the world became when it was withdrawn. Huzziya I didn't knock on the doors of power, he kicked them in with a dagger in one hand and a stolen crown in the other. This was no legitimate heir, but a usurper who clawed his way to the throne through a midnight massacre that left the royal bloodline in tatters. Yet what makes his story unforgettable isn't just the brutality of his rise. It's the eerie chorus of warnings that followed him to power, as if the gods themselves were sounding the alarm. The coup began with a deception so audacious it still shocks historians. According to fragmentary tablets from Tapika, Hattusili, then merely a high-ranking military officer, invited King Ammuna's sons to a feast honoring the storm god. But when the wine flowed and torches burned low, his men barred the doors. The surviving account, likely written by a survivor's scribe, describes how the princes were given to Teshub's lightning, a grisly euphemism for being struck down in what was supposed to be sacred space. By dawn, Hattusili paraded through Hattusa wearing the royal seal, his soldiers dragging the bodies of his rivals behind chariots as a warning, but the gods, it seemed, weren't fooled. Within weeks of his coronation, oracles across Anatolia began reporting disturbing signs. At the shrine of Nerik, priests interpreted a sacrificed lamb's liver as showing a serpent coiled around the sun, while in Kanish, a sudden hailstorm destroyed crops in a perfect spiral pattern, an omen scribes called the Wheel of Justice turning. Most chilling was the prophecy from an elderly seeress in Samuha, preserved on a cracked tablet. He who takes the throne in blood will lose it in fire, and the earth itself will reject his bones. Hattusili responded with a reign of paranoia disguised as piety. He rebuilt temples to the storm god, but excavations reveal hidden compartments in their foundations containing figurines of bound prisoners, likely curses against potential rivals. His legal decrees carried unusually specific punishments. One tablet threatens rebels with death by the same blade they wielded, a clear reference to his own violent ascent. Yet the more he tried to outrun fate, the tighter its grip became. A letter from a provincial governor complains of recurring dreams where a king without a face wandered the palace halls, an image that spread through the court like a plague. The end came as the prophecies foretold, in flames. The official account claims Hattusili died peacefully, but a recently deciphered tablet from a disgraced priest tells a different story. It describes how the king's bedchamber erupted in fire one autumn night, the blaze so intense that even the stones wept. Stranger still, witnesses reported hearing laughter from the flames, a detail later mythologized as the storm god reclaiming his stolen authority. When workers tried to bury his remains, the ground allegedly shook, forcing them to inter him outside sacred ground near a crossroads, a place of restless spirits. Later generations would spin wild legends around Hattusili's downfall. One popular tale claimed his ghost haunted the Taurus Mountains, demanding travelers answer riddles to prove their right to rule. Another described how his crown melted into his skull, creating a grotesque golden mask that couldn't be removed. These stories served a purpose, transforming a messy historical coup into a morality play about divine justice. Archaeology offers a subtler truth. Burn marks on the palace's northeast wing confirm a catastrophic fire during his reign, while a mass grave near Hattusa's gates contains skeletons with ceremonial daggers still clutched in their hands, likely loyalists who chose death over surrender. The real lesson of Hattusili's reign may be this: in a civilization where kingship was divinely ordained, even the mightiest usurper couldn't escape the weight of legitimacy. His name became synonymous with cursed ambition, a warning etched not just in clay but in the very fabric of Hittite memory. Muwatalli I lurks in the shadows of Hittite history, a king whose name appears tantalizingly in broken tablets and half-erased inscriptions, hinting at a reign far more significant than the scant records suggest. Unlike his better-documented successors, Muwatalli's story survives in fragments. A battle here, a temple dedication there, whispers of encounters with beings not quite human. Yet these scattered clues paint the portrait of a ruler who may have laid the groundwork for Hittite dominance, only to be forgotten by the very empire he helped build. One of the most enigmatic references comes from a damaged tablet found near the ruins of Kanish. It describes Muwatalli leading a campaign against the mysterious Men of Ohia, a term some scholars believe refers to early Mycenaean Greeks. The text mentions silver-armed warriors falling before the Hittite army, but the truly curious detail follows. After the battle, Muwatalli allegedly consulted with those who walk between worlds, receiving counsel that shaped his next decade of rule. Later scribes would identify these figures as the gods of the crossroads, chthonic deities associated with boundaries and transitions. Excavations at Muwatalli's presumed capital, Hakmes, revealed an unusually large shrine at the city's northern gate, its altars stained with both animal blood and a metallic substance that defied contemporary analysis, perhaps evidence of these obscure rituals. His military innovations suggest a mind ahead of his time. Clay tablets from Hattusili's archives credit Muwatalli with reorganizing the Hittite chariot corps into smaller, more mobile units, a tactic his famous namesake would later perfect against Ramses II at Kadesh. But the same records also speak of night messengers who could outrun the moon, possibly referring to an early courier system or something more esoteric. A relief carved into a forgotten cliffside near the Euphrates portrays a hooded figure presenting the king with what appears to be a bundle of lightning bolts, while a cuneiform inscription below reads, "He who knows the roads of earth and sky." The supernatural elements surrounding Muwatalli's reign reached their peak in the so-called Pact of the Two Suns. Discovered on a silver tablet in a provincial temple, this text describes how the king entered into a covenant with the solar goddess of Arena, promising to uphold justice in exchange for her favor. What sets it apart are the bizarre stipulations. Muwatalli was to judge certain cases when the sun stands still, likely a reference to solstice alignments, and to wear a mask of electrum during verdicts. Archaeologists found just such a mask in a hidden compartment beneath Hakmes's palace, its surface etched with microscopic symbols matching no known Hittite writing system. His disappearance from history is as mysterious as his life. Later king lists skip from Muwatalli directly to his successors, as if deliberately excising his memory. Yet certain clues persist. Annual festivals in outlying towns where masked dancers reenact the king's journey, or the persistent Anatolian folk belief that storms near old Hittite sites sometimes take humanoid shapes. Perhaps the most haunting artifact is a child's clay toy found near Hakmes, a crude figurine of a chariot pulled not by horses but by winged serpents. Muwatalli's true legacy might lie in what he represents, the forgotten architects of empire, those whose innovations outlived their names. Every time later, Hittite kings employed swift chariot tactics or invoked solar goddesses in their treaties. They were unwittingly echoing this ghost of their past. And maybe that's why his story feels so fragmented, not because it wasn't important, but because it became so fundamental that later generations forgot it had ever been invented. The greatest rulers don't just make history, they vanish into it, leaving only whispers and strange artifacts to mark their passage. Tudhaliya I didn't just reclaim lost territory, he resurrected an empire from the brink of extinction. When this 10th Hittite king took the throne, the realm was a shadow of its former glory, its borders gnawed by invaders, its temples plundered, even the sacred capital Hattusa abandoned to weeds and wolves. Yet within a decade, Tudhaliya would orchestrate one of history's most startling revivals, fueled by what he claimed were direct visions from the storm gods themselves. His reign became a turning point where military genius and mystical fervor fused into something extraordinary. The most striking evidence of Tudhaliya's divine claims comes from the Yazilikaya sanctuary, where archaeologists discovered a series of reliefs showing the king standing eye to eye with Teshub, the storm god, an unprecedented intimacy between mortal and deity. Accompanying texts describe how, as a young prince, Tudhaliya experienced a vision during a lightning storm near Mount Zalionu. The god allegedly handed him a golden axe and whispered strategy against the Kaskans, the nomadic tribes ravaging Hittite lands. Skeptics might dismiss this as propaganda, but Tudhaliya's subsequent campaigns bore eerie fruits. His forces adopted a revolutionary hammer and anvil tactic, using fortified mountain passes to funnel enemies into deadly chariot charges exactly as described in his vision. A tablet from Tapika records how Kaskan warriors fled battles claiming the thunder fought for Hattusili, their terror compounded by Tudhaliya's habit of timing attacks to coincide with storms. His military reforms went beyond tactics. Recognizing that manpower shortages crippled the empire, Tudhaliya instituted the Iron Oath, a binding covenant that transformed conquered territories into loyal provinces. Instead of slaughtering defeated foes, he absorbed their warriors into his armies, offering land grants in exchange for service. Administrative tablets show meticulous records of these integrations, with soldiers' origins noted alongside their new Hittite names. This wasn't just pragmatism. Tudhaliya framed it as divine will, citing a dream where Teshub gathered scattered pebbles into a single unbreakable slab. The strategy worked shockingly well. Within 5 years, his forces swelled with reformed Kaskans, Luwians, even former Hurrian mercenaries, all fighting under the storm god's banner. Yet Tudhaliya's most enduring legacy might be his reimagining of kingship itself. While predecessors ruled as warriors or priests, he styled himself the divine lightning rod, channeling celestial power to earth. Ritual texts from his reign describe ceremonies where priests would strike bronze plates to simulate thunder as the king gave oracles. At Aloka-Huryuk, excavators found a curious artifact, a rod of meteoric iron wrapped in gold foil, its surface inscribed with weather patterns. Experimental archaeologists demonstrated it could produce static sparks when rubbed, a plausible prototype for the legendary lightning scepter later kings would claim to wield. The myths surrounding Tudhaliya's death only deepened his mystique. Unlike rulers who faded quietly, his departure was staged as cosmic theater. Chronicles describe how he ascended Mount Harhana during a storm, promising to return when Hatti's need is greatest. Lightning allegedly split the peak as he vanished, leaving behind only his iron circlet fused to the rock. For centuries after, Hittite generals would make pilgrimages there before major campaigns, and folklore told of a spectral army led by a glowing king who appeared in thunderstorms. What makes Tudhaliya's revival truly remarkable isn't just the territories he reclaimed, but how he re-enchanted a broken people with purpose. His reign proved that empires aren't just rebuilt with swords and walls, but with stories powerful enough to make mortals believe they walk with gods. Even now, when thunderstorms roll over central Anatolia, locals still whisper that particular rumbles sound like chariot wheels are final, fitting tribute to the king who turned lightning into legend. Anuwanda I ruled with parchment and prophecy, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't swords but sacred oaths written under watching skies. While his predecessors had expanded the Hittite Empire through sheer military might, this 11th king mastered a subtler art, weaving alliances so tightly with divine threats and astral timing that breaking them seemed to invite cosmic retribution. His reign became a golden age of diplomatic witchcraft where every treaty carried not just royal seals, but curses whispered by priests during eclipses. The brilliance of Anuwanda's strategy lay in his understanding of sacred theater. Before signing his landmark pact with the Hayasa Azi tribes, he didn't just gather scribes, he staged the ceremony at Yazilikaya during the winter solstice, when shadow play on the rock walls made the carved gods appear to move. Tablets describe how priests sacrificed black bulls at the precise moment the sun touched the storm god's outstretched arm, while Anuwanda proclaimed that any violators would wither like these flames when water drowns them. Modern excavations at the site found layers of charred bones arranged in ritual patterns, confirming the elaborate nature of these ceremonies. His treaties weren't mere political documents, they were supernatural landmines. The famous Silver Tablet Treaty with Kizzuwatna contained 23 separate curses, each tailored to the signer's worst fears. One clause doomed oathbreakers to die childless as locusts eat their seed, while another promised their ancestors' spirits would wander thirsty in the underworld. But the true innovation came in how Anuwanda linked these threats to celestial events. A recently deciphered text reveals that certain curses activated only if broken during specific lunar phases, meaning a ruler might violate terms safely in one month, only to provoke divine fury in another. Archaeology confirms these pacts had teeth. At the ruins of Ugarit, researchers found a statue of a local governor who'd betrayed Anuwanda, its face deliberately smashed and buried beneath a threshold, exactly as described in treaty curses. Even more chilling is the Kamani covenant, where vassals swore loyalty while holding the god's rope, a symbolic noose that priests claimed would tighten in the afterlife for traitors. Letters from terrified local rulers beg for clarification on treaty terms, one anxiously asking whether crossing a border during a hailstorm counted as invoking the storm god's wrath. Yet Anuwanda's greatest masterstroke was his exploitation of natural phenomena. When a comet appeared during negotiations with the troublesome Kaskans, his priests declared it Teshub's chariot coming to witness their oath. The resulting treaty held for an unprecedented 3 generations long after Anuwanda's death. Similarly, he timed the eternal bond with Mitanni to coincide with a rare alignment of Venus and Jupiter, ensuring astrologers across Mesopotamia interpreted it as divinely sanctioned. The king's own end was as meticulously staged as his diplomacy. Sensing his decline, Anuwanda summoned all vassals to Hattusa for a final renewal of oaths, this time adding a new curse that his ghost would personally haunt any who broke faith. When he died shortly after, the empire remained eerily quiet, no province daring to test whether the dead king's spirit truly watched. Centuries later, Assyrian envoys would still report Hittite vassals refusing certain actions lest they wake Anuwanda's shadow. His legacy redefined power in the ancient world. By weaponizing the unseen celestial mechanics, ancestral spirits, the terror of divine retribution, this diplomat king achieved what armies couldn't, an empire held together by fear of the gods rather than the sword. Even now, when scholars unearth his treaties, they handle them with uneasy respect, as if those 3,000-year-old curses might still have sting. Tudhaliya II didn't just win battles, he dreamed them into existence, then vanished from history like a ghost in the fog. This was a king who turned sleep into strategy, whose campaigns unfolded with an uncanny precision that left enemies convinced he had stolen secrets from the gods themselves. While his predecessors relied on brute force or divine favor, Tudhaliya II wielded something far more potent, a mind that blurred the line between prophecy and tactics, leaving behind a legacy wrapped in riddles and abrupt silence. The first clue to his brilliance lies in the so-called dream tablets of Hattusa. Unearthed in a hidden alcove near the palace archives, these clay fragments describe Tudhaliya receiving nightly visions from the warrior goddess Inara. One account details how she showed him a valley where the rivers flowed uphill, a cryptic image that later inspired his infamous ambush at the Battle of the Inverted Waters. When enemy scouts reported the Hittite army retreating into a dead-end gorge, Tudhaliya's forces were already scaling the cliffs under cover of darkness. By dawn, they rained arrows and boulders onto trapped adversaries below, turning the terrain itself into a weapon. Modern geologists confirmed the site's unique acoustics. Shouts from above would echo as if coming from all directions, explaining ancient accounts of soldiers fleeing in terror from voices in the rock. His most startling innovation was the Shadow Regiment, a specialized unit trained to exploit superstition. Tablets from Kadesh describe how these warriors wore wolf pelts and moved only at twilight, their faces painted with phosphorescent fungi to appear spectral. Before the siege of Carchemish, they spent weeks haunting the city's outskirts, leaving clay figurines of underworld demons near water sources. By the time Tudhaliya's main force arrived, defenders were already half mad from sleep deprivation, convinced an army of the dead marched against them. Archaeologists found remnants of this psychological warfare, a stash of those very figurines buried beneath Carchemish's gates, their surfaces worn smooth from frantic touching by panicked fingers. Yet for all his military genius, Tudhaliya's final years are a void. The royal annals skip abruptly from victory parades to his son's coronation, with no mention of illness, battle wounds, or ritual burial. A single damaged letter from a Mitanni spy hints at something darker. The dreamer king wakes no more, yet his bedchamber echoes with whispers. Excavations at Sarissa uncovered a sealed underground chamber containing an empty throne surrounded by 28 clay beds, each inscribed with a different month of the lunar calendar. Was this some ritual space where Tudhaliya sought eternal visions, or a tomb for a ruler who, in the end, might have preferred the company of dreams to the waking world? The mystery deepens with folk traditions that outlasted the empire itself. Even in Roman times, Anatolian shepherds told of a sleeping king beneath Mount Zalayanu who would awaken when invaders threatened the land. Perhaps that's Tudhaliya's true legacy, not just the battles he won, but the legend he became, the strategist who slipped into the realm of myth, leaving history to wonder where the man ended and the dream began. Hattusili II exists in the blurred edges of history, a king whose very reality scholars still debate, yet whose legend grew so potent it outshone flesh and blood rulers. Some tablets call him a mighty conqueror who reclaimed lost territories, others a phantom inserted by later scribes to fill gaps in the royal line. But the most fascinating texts don't argue about his deeds at all. They speak of a ruler who walked so closely with the gods he became something more than human. The controversy begins with the archives themselves. At Hattusa, two sets of annals clash dramatically. The silver chamber tablets describe Hattusili leading campaigns against the Arzawa kingdoms, complete with vivid details like his war chariot draped in lynx pelts and the singing arrows his archers used to terrify enemies. Yet the Gatehouse Chronicles, written just decades later, omit him entirely, jumping from Tudhaliya II to his successor. Modern archaeologists made a breakthrough when they analyzed the clay. Both sets came from the same royal workshop, suggesting this wasn't some later forgery, but a deliberate contradiction baked into history from the start. What's undeniable is how later generations transformed Hattusili into something supernatural. The Stormcaller stele, discovered near the Black Sea coast, shows him not just praying to the weather gods but seemingly conversing with them as equals. The accompanying text describes how he ended a decade-long drought by climbing Mount Harhara with nothing but a copper staff, then striking a rock until the sky answered with tears. Geologists confirm a major earthquake struck the region around this time. Could Hattusili have predicted it, turning natural disaster into divine theater? The rituals attached to his name blur the lines even further. At Yazilikaya, priests performed an annual ceremony where a masked figure representing Hattusili would judge disputes between statues of gods, his decisions sealed by pouring molten silver into cracks in the stone. More chilling are the Door of Voices tablets from Nerik, detailing how oracles channeled the dead king's wisdom during crises, a practice that continued for 2 centuries after his supposed death. Excavations at the site revealed a tunnel system beneath the temple where acoustics could make whispers sound like thunder, suggesting how priests might have engineered these visitations. Perhaps the most tangible evidence of his legacy lies in the artifacts. A dagger unearthed at Alakahyuk bears Hattusili's name alongside an inscription claiming it was forged in heaven's fire. Metallurgical analysis showed the blade contained nickel percentages found only in meteoric iron, a material the Hittites revered as divine. Even his possible tomb defies explanation. A subterranean chamber near Hattusa containing an empty sarcophagus lined with electrified amber, its walls painted with constellations that didn't match the night sky of his era, but would align perfectly 3,000 years later. Whether warlord or wraith, Hattusili II left an indelible mark. Later kings invoked him in treaties as the mediator between realms, while common folk left offerings at crossroads shrines well into Roman times, seeking his counsel in dreams. His greatest trick wasn't conquering lands or bending gods to his will. It was making sure history could never quite decide whether to bury him among the kings or raise him to the stars. Tudhaliya III didn't just rule an empire, he rewrote its very operating system, turning chaos into order with reforms so sweeping they seemed stamped with celestial approval. When this 14th Hittite king ascended the throne, the realm was buckling under the weight of its own growth. Tax rolls in disarray, temples hoarding resources, and provincial governors acting like petty kings. But what followed wasn't merely bureaucratic tidying. It was a revolution dressed in divine portents, one that would leave Hattusa forever transformed. The heart of his reforms pulsed in the bronze tablet edicts, a legal code so meticulously organized it still astonishes historians. Unlike earlier decrees carved in stone, these were cast in durable metal and distributed to every major city, ensuring uniform enforcement. Excavations at Suppiluliuma I uncovered one such tablet, its surface divided into 3 precise columns, the first listing standardized weights and measures, the second establishing fixed tax rates based on land quality, and the third, most revolutionary, granting peasants the right to appeal corrupt officials directly to the crown. But the true stroke of genius lay in how Tudhaliya framed these changes. Each edict opened with the phrase, "as the stars decree," linking administrative tweaks to cosmic order. Astral symbolism became his signature. When introducing a new lunar calendar to synchronize tax collection, Tudhaliya staged a midnight ceremony at Yazilikaya during a total eclipse. Priests chanted as scribes recorded how the moon's shadow perfectly traced the relief of the sun goddess's outstretched hand, interpreted as divine endorsement. Later, when reforming the military draft, he timed the announcement to coincide with Mars aligning above Hattusa's watchtowers, heralding it as the warlord's nod. Even skeptics couldn't deny the uncanny timing. A preserved letter from a regional governor complains about the king's stars always favoring him, while reluctantly admitting harvests did improve under the new systems. Yet for all his successes, Tudhaliya's reign ended under a cloud literally. Midway through his 12th year, a peculiar sickness gripped him. The royal physician's tablets describe symptoms no modern diagnosis fully explains. Bouts of clarity alternating with trance-like states, hands that turned cold as mountain springs even in summer, and an eerie ability to recite temple archives word for word during fevers. Most haunting is the account of his final public appearance, where he reportedly pointed to a comet overhead and murmured, "The gods require examination papers." Within days, he was dead. Later generations would spin conflicting legends around his illness. Some temple texts called it a sacred trial, the gods testing whether mortals could handle his reforms. Others whispered of poison slipped by nobles resentful of lost privileges. The most poignant theory comes from a fragmentary hymn found near his tomb, suggesting Tudhaliya knowingly drank the cup of understanding to commune with deities too long, burning through his mortal form. Whatever the truth, his legacy proved ironclad. Those bronze tablet edicts outlasted empires, their principles echoing in laws from Babylon to Rome. And perhaps that's the ultimate tribute to this reformer king. He built systems so sturdy they needed no miracles to endure, just the occasional nudge from the stars. Suppiluliuma I didn't just expand an empire, he redefined what an empire could be. When this 15th Hittite king seized power, the realm was already formidable, but under his iron grip, it would stretch from the Aegean coast to the Euphrates, swallowing rival kingdoms like a storm swallowing clouds. Yet what set Suppiluliuma apart wasn't just military might. It was his uncanny ability to spin divine omens and political gambles into absolute dominion. His reign became a masterclass in empire building, where every conquest was sanctified by the gods and every betrayal twisted back onto the betrayer. The first sign of his greatness came not on the battlefield but in the stars. Early in his reign, court astrologers recorded a rare celestial event, Mars, the warrior's planet, lingering unusually long in the constellation of the Bull. Suppiluliuma I wasted no time declaring this a mandate from Teshub himself. The storm god's promise that all lands under the bull's gaze would bow to Hattusa. What followed was a campaign so meticulously planned it felt predestined. His forces moved with terrifying precision, toppling the Hayaasa-Azi Confederation in the north before sweeping south to crush Mitanni, Hatti's longtime rival. But the true stroke of genius came after victory. Instead of slaughtering Mitanni's royal line, Suppiluliuma I installed a puppet king married to his own daughter, weaving bloodlines into a living net of control. A tablet from Carchemish boasts how he planted his sons like trees across conquered lands, and archaeology confirms it. Royal seals bearing his dynasty's name have been found as far as Ugarit and Aleppo. Yet Suppiluliuma's most infamous moment unfolded not on a battlefield, but in a palace intrigue dripping with supernatural dread. The Zananza affair began with a letter from an Egyptian queen, likely the widow of Tutankhamun, pleading for a Hittite prince to marry and rule beside her. Suspicious but intrigued, Suppiluliuma sent his youngest son, Zananza, with lavish gifts and armed escorts. The prince never reached Thebes. Hittite accounts claim Egyptian factions opposing the alliance ambushed his caravan, while Egyptian records ominously state the gods rejected the foreign seed. But the grisly details emerge from a cache of curse tablets found near Hattusa's Lion Gate, texts describing how Suppiluliuma's priests conducted night rituals with Zananza's recovered belongings, summoning Egyptian underworld demons to feast upon the murderers' souls. Contemporary Egyptian medical texts later describe a plague outbreak coinciding with these dates, lending eerie credence to the Hittites' claims of supernatural vengeance. Suppiluliuma's response to the betrayal was as strategic as it was brutal. Rather than launching an immediate invasion, he unleashed something subtler, a whispering campaign painting Egypt as oath-breakers cursed by the gods. When he finally marched south years later, many Canaanite cities surrendered without fighting, their priests having interpreted recent locust swarms as proof of divine displeasure. The king's genius lay in understanding that fear of celestial wrath could conquer lands faster than any army. His death was as dramatic as his life, after contracting plague during the Egyptian campaign, possibly the same one his curses had allegedly unleashed. Suppiluliuma staged his own apotheosis. Court scribes recorded his final speech, where he claimed Teshub appeared to him in a fever dream, promising a seat among the immortals. The funeral pyre burned so hot, witnesses claimed, that the smoke formed a thunderhead over Hattusa, unleashing a downpour as his ashes cooled. Whether by design or destiny, Suppiluliuma had become the storm itself, a force that reshaped empires, then vanished into legend, leaving behind a dominion that would tremble at his name for centuries. His successors would invoke him in treaties not just as a king but as a spectral enforcer. May Suppiluliuma's shade stalk the oath-breakers' dreams. Few empty threats carried more weight in the ancient world. Even at the height of his power, Suppiluliuma I couldn't outrun the whispers that the gods themselves had turned against Hatti's conqueror. The plague began innocuously enough, a cough among palace servants, a fever that felled a handful of soldiers. But within months, it sprawled into a catastrophe that emptied entire districts of Hattusa. What made this outbreak different wasn't just its scale, it was the chilling timing. The sickness arrived mere weeks after Suppiluliuma's forces desecrated temples in the fallen Mitanni capital of Washukani, looting statues of the healing goddess Shoshka. Coincidence? The terrified populace didn't think so. Tablets from this period reveal a court gripped by supernatural dread. The Black Clay archives describe priests performing nightly purifications, their robes smeared with a paste of powdered obsidian and juniper meant to repel evil spirits. One desperate ritual involved burying live rams at crossroads while chanting backwards versions of royal hymns, a clear attempt to undo whatever cosmic offense had triggered the plague. The most haunting account comes from a scribe named Ammuna, who recorded how Suppiluliuma I himself presided over a ceremony where 3 generations of royal ancestors were summoned from the underworld to plead for mercy. The kicker, their ghostly replies transcribed in trembling cuneiform, allegedly accused the king of stealing what the gods had not given. Yet Suppiluliuma I wasn't about to kneel before fate. His response blended pragmatism and paranoia in equal measure. Medical texts from his reign show unprecedented attention to quarantine measures. Soldiers with rashes were isolated in reed huts downwind from camps, while merchants from infected cities faced 30-day holds at border forts. But these sensible precautions coexisted with darker measures. Excavations at the Tawania fortress uncovered mass graves containing not just plague victims, but the bodies of foreign merchants and political rivals, their hands bound with cords knotted in apotropaic patterns. Had Suppiluliuma I resorted to scapegoating, or were these grim offerings part of some forgotten purification rite? The king's own illness reads like a cosmic irony. Egyptian prisoners captured during his retaliatory campaigns apparently carried the plague into Hittite ranks, the same disease his curses may have unleashed on them years earlier. Court physicians' notes describe Suppiluliuma I's symptoms with eerie detachment. First a burning shadow beneath his ribs, then fingers that blackened like charred twigs, and finally a madness that made him dictate letters to long-dead rivals. His final coherent act was reportedly to order the construction of a mirror palace, a replica of his royal residence built entirely from copper and electrum, meant to confuse vengeful spirits. Workers had barely laid the foundations when the king drew his last rattling breath. The aftermath split Hittite memory down the middle. Official chronicles framed Suppiluliuma I's death as a noble sacrifice, claiming he voluntarily drank the god's bitter cup to spare his people. But folk traditions tell a different story. For generations, Anatolian mothers warned misbehaving children that Suppiluliuma I's cough would visit them at night, a spectral hack echoing from the underworld where the plague bringer eternally wandered. Modern archaeology adds another twist. Soil samples from his suspected tomb show abnormally high concentrations of mercury and belladonna, poisons known to ancient physicians. Was the great king's end natural, or did some loyal priest ease his suffering with a merciful draught? Perhaps the truth lies in the artifacts left behind. Among the ruins of his copper mirror palace, excavators found a single intact object, a lapis lazuli scarab of Egyptian manufacture, its underside engraved with a curse in hieroglyphs so tiny they'd escaped notice for millennia. The inscription, "All who disturb Maat shall feed the flies of Set." History remembers Suppiluliuma as the empire builder, the strategist, the storm made flesh. But that little blue beetle murmurs another possibility, that even the mightiest kings are just mortals in the end, dancing to divine rhythms they can neither control nor comprehend. Ammuna II inherited a crown weighed down by grief and pestilence, a king destined to rule not over golden victories, but over funeral pyres and abandoned temples. When this 16th Hittite monarch took the throne, his father Suppiluliuma's empire stretched farther than ever before, but its heart was rotting from within. The same plague that had felled the great conqueror now gnawed at Hattusili's foundations, turning palaces into infirmaries and battle cries into death rattles. Ammuna's tragedy wasn't just the brevity of his reign, it was the cruel irony of a ruler who poured every ounce of his being into halting a disaster foretold from his first breath. The omens began before his coronation. A fragmentary tablet from the royal archives describes court diviners examining the liver of a sacrificial lamb only to find it black as a moonless night and riddled with unnatural perforations. Later, astrologers recorded Saturn, the celestial marker of kings, being swallowed by the constellation of the Scorpion for 3 consecutive nights. Worst of all was the whispered prophecy attributed to a blind seeress in Samuha, that the new king would reign as many years as fingers on a newborn's hand. When Anuwanda took power in 1322 before the Common Era, the math was grimly precise. He would rule for just 5 years, yet his response defied fatalism. Medical texts from his reign reveal groundbreaking attempts at containment. Anuwanda established quarantine camps beyond city walls where the infected were given clean water and honey poultices, a radical departure from the abandonment practiced elsewhere. At the storm god's temple in Nerik, archaeologists uncovered a vast pit filled with smashed pottery, all bearing traces of oregano and thyme oil. These were likely disinfectant vessels used in rituals meant to purify both body and soul. The king even ordered the creation of boundary stones of health, markers warning travelers away from plague-stricken regions while promising divine protection to those who obeyed. His most desperate act blended science and superstition. Tablets from Tapika describe how Anuwanda sent envoys to Egypt, the very nation his father had cursed, bearing gifts in exchange for healers. The correspondence that followed reads like a thriller: clandestine meetings in coastal cities, Egyptian physicians disguised as merchants, and ultimately, a secret cargo of black poppy extract and kepa wax amulets arriving in Hattusa. For a fleeting moment it seemed to work. Mortality rates dipped briefly, and fragments of a victory hymn celebrate the serpent of disease recoiling from the king's light. Then came the backlash. Traditionalist priests saw foreign medicine as blasphemy, interpreting a subsequent earthquake as Teshub's wrath. Worse, the plague mutated. A heartbreaking administrative list from Hakpi's records: entire families, sleeping and not waking, their deaths so sudden they were found with meal bowls still in hand. The final blow fell when Anuwanda himself collapsed during a purification rite at Yazilikaya. His fever so high witnesses claimed steam rose from his golden crown. His deathbed scene became legend. According to temple scribes, the dying king demanded to be carried to the palace roof where he could see storm clouds gathering. As lightning split the sky, he allegedly whispered, "I go to argue our case before the Council of Gods." The subsequent funerary rites broke all precedents. Instead of the usual 70-day mourning period, priests performed an accelerated deification protocol, burning cedar effigies to carry Anuwanda's essence skyward before the plague could claim his soul. What's remarkable is how thoroughly this short-lived king infiltrated Hittite spirituality. Later generations worshipped him as Ananza, a minor deity invoked during epidemics. Excavations at lesser-known shrines reveal clay figurines depicting a robed figure holding a serpent and a jar, clearly representing healing. Even the Romans, centuries later, recorded an Anatolian folk practice of leaving Anuwanda's cups, small bowls of milk and honey, at crossroads during plagues. The cruelest twist: recent DNA analysis of bones from his reign suggests the pathogen was likely tularemia, a disease treatable with modern antibiotics. Anuwanda battled the right war with the wrong weapons, his tragedy lying not in lack of effort, but in being born 3,000 years too soon. In the end, his greatest legacy wasn't the years he ruled, but the lengths he went to protect his people. A king who fought death itself until his last breath, then became the very god his successors prayed to when facing their own mortality. Mursili II didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited a nightmare. Plague had hollowed out the Hittite Empire, leaving villages silent and temples overflowing with unburied dead. The gods had turned their faces away, or so it seemed, until this 17-year-old king did something unprecedented. He didn't just beg for divine mercy, he demanded answers. What unfolds in his surviving prayers isn't the usual royal propaganda, but raw, soul-bearing dialogues with the heavens that blur the line between politics and piety. The plague prayers of Mursili stand as one of history's most astonishing religious documents. Unlike the stiff formality of other royal correspondence with deities, these texts pulse with urgency and even frustration. One tablet begins with the shocking line, "O gods, what is this you have done?" before cataloguing how the empire's heartlands had become. a house of weeping where even the mourners have perished. Archaeologists working at Hattusili's royal archives found these prayers weren't carefully edited for public consumption. They're scratched into clay in frantic, uneven cuneiform, some bearing fingerprints where the scribe's hand had clearly trembled. Mursili's approach to divine communication was revolutionary. Previous kings blamed enemies or natural cycles for disasters, but he conducted what reads like a theological investigation. In Prayer 27, he systematically reviews possible offenses. Had his father Suppiluliuma I broken oaths? Had temple rituals been performed incorrectly? Most startling is his suggestion that the plague might stem from forgotten sins of his ancestors, an idea almost unheard of in ancient Near Eastern theology. This wasn't groveling, it was negotiation, with Mursili essentially saying, "Tell me what we did wrong and we'll fix it." The political genius of these prayers lies in their transparency. Mursili had them read aloud at provincial shrines, transforming private anguish into public catharsis. A tablet from Tapika describes villagers weeping as scribes recited his words, then spontaneously bringing offerings to local altars. By sharing his spiritual crisis, the king turned passive suffering into collective action. Every citizen became a participant in appeasing the gods. Excavations across Anatolia reveal a fascinating pattern. Plague pits from early in his reign contain haphazard burials, but later ones show careful arrangements with ritual objects, proof his message had reshaped how people faced death. Then came the miracle or masterstroke. After years of relentless prayers, the plague abruptly ceased. Mursili didn't claim personal credit. He attributed the deliverance to a dream where the storm god Teshub instructed him to reinstate neglected festivals for the underworld deities. The subsequent Festival of the Returned Sun became legendary, with texts describing how priests carried torches from dawn till dusk to symbolically repay the stolen light of lost lives. Modern epidemiologists note the plague's decline coincides with documented weather shifts toward cooler temperatures. Did Mursili interpret natural climate variation as divine intervention? His reign's second half reveals how deeply this crisis shaped governance. Administrative tablets show temple scribes gaining unprecedented influence, their recommendations on public health and morality woven into law. But this wasn't theocracy. Mursili's edicts balanced spiritual and practical concerns. One decree ordered the construction of clean water houses near every major shrine, blending hygiene with piety. Another mandated that legal disputes involving priests be settled by both royal judges and oracle readings, creating an early separation of sacred and secular authority. The artifacts left behind tell their own story. At Yazilikaya, archaeologists found a unique relief showing Mursili not in triumphant battle pose, but kneeling with a scroll, the only Hittite king depicted this way. Even more telling is his seal. Where predecessors used images of lions or storm gods, Mursili's bears a stylized bee symbolizing diligent prayer hovering over a supplicant's hand. When death finally claimed him after 25 tumultuous years, Mursili left behind more than a stabilized empire. He'd redefined Hittite kingship itself. Future rulers would emulate his intimate prayer style, but none matched his raw vulnerability. Perhaps that's why his ghost lingered so stubbornly in folk memory. Centuries after Hattusili's fall, Roman travelers in Anatolia recorded locals still leaving clay tablets at ruined Hittite shrines, brief notes to the gods penned in the manner of the prayer king. In the end, Mursili's greatest legacy wasn't just ending a plague, but proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon a leader can wield isn't a sword, but an honest question shouted into the void, and the courage to listen for the answer. Mursili II didn't merely receive dreams, he dissected them with the precision of a scholar and the urgency of a king whose empire hung in the balance. The royal archives at Hattusili preserve over 24 meticulously recorded dream tablets, each one a window into a mind that saw the divine and the tactical as inseparable. Where other rulers might dismiss midnight visions as fleeting illusions, Mursili treated them as classified dispatches from the gods, scouring their symbols for clues to heal his plague-ravaged realm. One of the most revealing records describes a recurring dream where the storm god Teshub appeared not in his usual thunderous glory, but as a physician holding a scale. On one side sat a huddled mass representing the Hittite people, on the other, a single clay tablet inscribed with unfamiliar hieroglyphs. Mursili's interpretation was startlingly pragmatic. He ordered scribes to audit temple offerings across the empire, uncovering neglected rituals to Egyptian underworld deities, a nod to the foreign script in his vision. Within months, these restored ceremonies coincided with the plague's first decline, cementing his reputation as history's first forensic dreamer. His military strategies bore the same uncanny stamp of celestial counsel. Before campaigning against the rebellious Kaskans, Mursili dreamed of a wolf with iron teeth gnawing at a mountain's roots. Court priests initially warned this signaled impending doom, but the king passed it differently. The wolf represented relentless persistence, the mountain the enemy's stronghold. He adjusted his tactics accordingly, abandoning frontal assaults for a years-long blockade that starved the Kaskans into submission. Later, when his generals questioned the unorthodox strategy, Mursili produced a follow-up dream where the same wolf vomited gemstones, proof, he argued, that endurance would yield unexpected riches. Excavations at the besieged sites later confirmed his hunch. The Kaskan storehouses contained smuggled lapis lazuli from as far away as Afghanistan. Yet not all divine messages came neatly decoded. A fragmentary tablet from his 20th regnal year describes a terrifying nightmare where the sun goddess Arina plunged into the Euphrates, only to re-emerge as a skeleton draped in honeycomb. For once, Mursili admitted bafflement, convening a council of seers, physicians, and even a captured Babylonian astronomer. Their collective interpretation became a masterclass in ancient crisis management. The river symbolized unrest in Syrian vassal states, the honeycomb represented their economic value, and the skeletal sun signaled that suppressing rebellion too harshly would poison long-term loyalty. The compromise he engineered, replacing executed rebel leaders with their younger, more impressionable sons, became standard Hittite policy for generations. What sets Mursili's dream journals apart is their startling intimacy. Unlike the grandiose prophecies fabricated by later kings, his tablets include moments of doubt, even reproach. After one particularly cryptic vision, he scribbled in the margin, "Why do you speak in riddles, O Teshub? A king needs clear words." Another entry describes bargaining with the gods like a merchant haggling at market, promising expanded temples in exchange for specific signs. This wasn't passive mysticism, it was an active, sometimes contentious dialogue with the divine. Archaeology hints at how these visions physically manifested. At the ruins of his bedchamber in Hattusili, researchers found an unusual copper and crystal device resembling a modern seismometer. Its weighted arms could detect subtle tremors, suggesting Mursili may have interpreted earthly vibrations as divine messages during his famous shaking trances. Nearby, they uncovered jars of psychotropic herbs like blue lotus and Syrian rue ingredients known to induce vivid dreams in precise doses. The ultimate testament to his dream diplomacy lies in an artifact now housed in Ankara's Museum of Anatolian Civilizations, a treaty tablet with Egypt signed late in his reign. Unlike standard diplomatic language invoking generic blessings, this one uniquely specifies that violations would be punished by the nightmares of Mursili's gods. Even Ramses' Roman II envoys, no strangers to spiritual threats, reportedly balked at this clause. For a king who'd turned his sleeping mind into a strategic weapon, it was the perfect signature, a reminder that in the Hittite world, the line between the celestial and the tactical wasn't just blurred, it was imaginary. Muwatalli II didn't just face Ramses the Great at Kadesh, he rewrote the rules of divine warfare. turning a single battle into a cosmic showdown where gods and mortals fought side by side. Picture the year 1274 before the Common Era, the Orontes River running red, the air thick with the screams of chariot horses and the deafening clash of bronze. But this wasn't just a struggle between two empires, it was a collision of egos wrapped in sacred myth, where each king claimed the heavens fought for them. And at the center of it all stood Muwatalli, a Hittite ruler who weaponized deception, geography, and storm god symbolism to nearly shatter Egypt's golden confidence. The build-up to Kadesh reveals Muwatalli's tactical genius. While Ramses boasted of divine visions guiding him, the Hittite king orchestrated the ultimate illusion. Clay tablets recovered from Hattusili detail how he disguised elite warriors as local farmers, sending them to feed false intelligence about his army's distant position. Meanwhile, his real force, an unprecedented 37,000 strong, lay concealed behind the city's eastern ridge. But Muwatalli didn't stop at human trickery. Knowing Ramses saw himself as the living incarnation of Ammon, the Hittite king staged a psychological masterstroke. On the eve of battle, priests conducted rituals where they bound effigies of Egyptian deities with iron chains, then submerged them in the Orontes. When dawn broke, scouts reported the river ran unnaturally dark, a portent his troops interpreted as Teshub drowning the enemy gods. The battle itself unfolded like a divine chess match. As Ramses' overextended forces fell into the Hittite trap, Muwatalli's chariots descended like a thunderbolt, splitting the Egyptian ranks. Contemporary Hittite texts describe how the king stood atop a silver-plated observation platform, draped in a lynx pelt said to channel Teshub's power. At the critical moment when Ramses famously rallied his bodyguard, Hittite accounts claim Muwatalli unleashed his secret weapon, the storm drum, a colossal bronze kettledrum mounted on a wagon that mimicked thunder when struck. The psychological impact was devastating. Egyptian horses panicked, and even Ramses' later victory poem admits his troops faltered at the sky's unnatural roar. Yet the battle's true mystery lies in its aftermath. Both sides declared victory. Ramses' temples show him single-handedly crushing Hittite hordes, while Muwatalli's scribes wrote of the sun turning back at Kadesh to witness Egypt's humiliation. Archaeology offers tantalizing clues. Excavations at the site revealed an unusual concentration of Hittite arrowheads near the Egyptian camp's hypothesized location, suggesting they indeed breached Ramses' lines. But just as compelling is a fragmentary letter from Muwatalli to his brother, boasting that while he allowed the falcon to flee, he kept the real prize, Kadesh itself. The city remained firmly in Hittite hands for years after, its temples rededicated to Teshub with frescoes showing the storm god trampling Egyptian icons. Muwatalli's legacy extends beyond the battlefield. In the years following Kadesh, he relocated the Hittite capital to Tahantasa, a move some scholars interpret as a cosmic realignment. The new city's layout mirrored celestial patterns, with its main avenue oriented toward Mount Hazi, the mythical home of Teshub. Even his royal seal changed, replacing the traditional sun disk with a stylized thunderbolt. This wasn't just politics, it was the crystallization of a world-view where earthly power flowed from divine favor, hard-won through rituals as much as spears. The ultimate irony, Muwatalli's greatest victory may have been convincing history he lost. While Ramses' bombastic monuments ensured his version endured, Hittite pragmatism won the peace. The Treaty of Kadesh, signed years later, saw Egypt quietly abandon claims to the region, and perhaps that's the real lesson of Muwatalli's reign, that sometimes letting your enemy boast while you keep the land is the truest form of triumph. His ghost still lingers in the whispers of modern Syrian farmers near Kadesh, who swear that when thunder rolls across the Orontes plain, you can hear the echo of bronze drums and the laughter of a king who outplayed the gods themselves. Teshub never intended to be a cautionary tale, yet history remembers him as the king who lost everything twice over, first his throne, then his dignity. When this 19th Hittite ruler took power under the name Mursili III, the empire still basked in the afterglow of Kadesh's strategic victory. But beneath the surface, fault lines were cracking open, and Hittite's greatest enemy wasn't Egypt or Assyria. It was his own uncle Hattusili, a battle-scarred general who viewed the young king as a pampered upstart unworthy of Suppiluliuma's bloodline. What followed wasn't just a political coup, but a masterclass in psychological warfare where curses carried as much weight as chariots. The conflict began with subtle humiliations. Tablets from Hattusa describe how Hattusili, as governor of the northern territories, deliberately withheld tribute shipments by losing them in bureaucratic delays, a power play disguised as incompetence. When Hittite demanded loyalty oaths, his uncle complied with caveats. One surviving document shows Hattusili swearing allegiance so long as the king rules justly, an implied threat cloaked in piety. The young monarch retaliated by stripping Hattusili's control over the sacred city of Nerik, but this backfired spectacularly. Provincial troops, fiercely loyal to their warrior governor, began deserting Hittite's campaigns, whispering that the storm god's favor had shifted. Then came the dreams, or more accurately, the weaponization of them. Hattusili's scribes circulated visions allegedly sent by the goddess Ishtar, showing the uncle receiving a broken crown that mended itself in his hands. Hittite's priests counterattacked with their own nocturnal propaganda. A tablet from Hakpi's records a royal dream where Teshub handed the king an unbreakable scepter while Hattusili knelt gagged with a copper wire. This wasn't mere superstition, it was early information warfare designed to shake confidence in both courts. The actual rebellion unfolded like a slow-acting poison. Hattusili didn't storm Hattusa with an army. He eroded Hittite's legitimacy piece by piece. First came the miracle at Zippalanda, where a statue of the storm god reportedly wept blood after the king reduced temple grain allotments. Then a carefully timed eclipse interpreted by Hattusili's astrologers as divine disapproval of Hittite's tax reforms. By the time the uncle marched on the capital, half the nobility had already defected, convinced the gods had switched sides. Exile only sharpened Hittite's wrath. Banished to a coastal fortress in what's now Syria, he transformed bitter defeat into supernatural vengeance. Archaeologists working at Ugarit discovered a set of lead curse tablets buried beneath the city's gates, each one bearing Hittite's seal and chillingly specific imprecations. One called upon the underworld god Lelwani to twist Hattusili's bones like wax, while another doomed his descendants to die mid-sentence, their words choking them. The most inventive invoked a demon called the Silent One to infiltrate Hattusili's dreams and steal his breath between one snore and the next. Hattusili's response reveals how seriously he took these threats. His scribes composed an entire counter-ritual, the Litany of the Just Ruler, which priests recited daily at crossroads to trample the serpent of falsehood. More pragmatically, he installed Hittite's own sister as high priestess at Hattusa, a move both conciliatory and calculating, since her presence supposedly neutralized her brother's curses through blood magic. The deposed king's final act was pure theatrical spite. When Hattusili negotiated a treaty with Egypt, Hittite somehow smuggled a letter to Ramses II, urging him to reject the pact because the true son of Hatti still lives. The sheer audacity, a fallen monarch meddling in international diplomacy from his gilded cage, speaks volumes about Hittite royal feuds. These weren't mere power struggles, they were battles for cosmic legitimacy, where every insult, dream, and curse carried the weight of divine judgment. Hittite's legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. Centuries later, Assyrian exorcist manuals would reference the Hittite binding spells, likely distorted versions of his infamous curses. Even today, Syrian farmers near his exile site tell of a restless jinn who offers political advice in dreams, perhaps the last echo of a king who learned too late that in the Game of Thrones, the gods favor not the righteous but the ruthless. Hattusili III clawed his way to power from the most unlikely of places, not a palace, but a windswept fortress on the empire's northern fringe, where exiled nobles were meant to fade into obscurity. This wasn't just a political comeback, it was a resurrection orchestrated with equal parts battlefield grit and celestial showmanship. While other kings inherited thrones, Hattusili built his from scratch, brick by divine brick, with the storm god Teshub whispering in one ear and his formidable queen, the priestess Pujuhepa, in the other. The turning point came in the dead of winter during his exile in Hakhmes. Tablets recovered from the site describe a vision that would alter Hittite history, the goddess Ishtar appearing to Hattusili in a storm, her voice cutting through thunder as she handed him a shattered sword that reformed in his hands. This wasn't just spiritual comfort, it was political dynamite. Hattusili's scribes immediately circulated accounts of the miracle, framing his rebellion against Teshub as a holy mandate. But the true masterstroke came next. At a critical battle near the Kizilirmak River, Hattusili timed his attack to coincide with a solar eclipse, his troops interpreting the darkened sun as Ishtar blotting out his rival's legitimacy. Yet Hattusili knew divine theatrics alone wouldn't hold an empire. His marriage to Pujuhepa, high priestess of the Hurrian storm goddess Hebat, wasn't just a love match, it was a merger of cosmic portfolios. Together, they performed rituals where Pujuhepa channeled Hebat's oracles while Hattusili enacted them, blurring the line between policy and prophecy. A clay tablet from their reign details a ceremony where the queen read the will of the gods in the patterns of oil on water, directing tax reforms and troop deployments with equal authority. Foreign envoys left their court unnerved, unsure whether they'd negotiated with monarchs or mediums. Diplomacy under this power couple became its own kind of sorcery. When Egypt's Ramses II demanded unfavorable terms, Pujuhepa didn't just protest, she sent back a letter invoking the wrath of the 7,000 gods of Hatti, accompanied by a lock of her hair, a potent Hurrian curse ingredient. The usually boastful pharaoh reportedly delayed his response for months, consulting his own priests. Meanwhile, Hattusili played the long game, leveraging his wife's reputation to spin a web of alliances. Their daughter's marriage to a Babylonian prince came with a chilling clause. Betrayal would invoke not just earthly consequences, but Pujuhepa's personal curse, to walk sleepless through the dreams of your grandchildren. Archaeology reveals how thoroughly they rewrote the rules of legitimacy. At Yazilikaya, a new relief appeared alongside the traditional pantheon. Hattusili and Pujuhepa standing shoulder to shoulder with Teshub and Hebat, the mortal and divine couples mirroring each other in posture and power. Even their seals told a story. Hattusili's bore the storm god's lightning bolt, while Pujuhepa's showed a loom, symbolizing her ability to weave fate itself. The survivor king's final act cemented his legend. Nearing death, he didn't just name a successor, he staged an elaborate coronation of the shades, where priests summoned the spirits of past kings to endorse his son Tudhaliya. Witnesses swore the ceremonial torches burned blue that night, and the clay tablets recording the event were baked with crushed lapis lazuli, as if to tether the ritual to the heavens. It was the perfect capstone to a reign built on miracles. Hattusili the exile, who turned divine whispers into an empire and proved that in Hatti, the line between politics and the paranormal was always thinner than a razor's edge. Pujuhepa wasn't just Hattusili's queen, she was the storm goddess Hebat made flesh, her dreams shaping policy and her curses rewriting destinies. Where other royal couples ruled side by side, this pair blurred the lines between throne and altar, their reign a fusion of divine theatrics and razor-sharp statecraft. Clay tablets from Hattus's archives reveal how Pujuhepa's nightly visions became law by dawn, her trance-induced prophecies dictating everything from tax rates to troop deployments. One particularly striking record describes her channeling Hebat during a lunar eclipse, demanding the immediate pardon of Syrian merchants accused of spying, a move that later secured vital trade routes through the region. The king's scribes didn't merely record these decrees, they etched them into silver tablets and sealed them with her personal sigil, a bee symbolizing both industry and the supernatural honey used in her rituals. Their spiritual reforms transformed Hittite religion into a weapon of soft power. At the rocky sanctuary of Yazilikaya, Pujuhepa masterminded the addition of Hurrian deities to the traditional pantheon, carving their likenesses alongside Hittite gods in a celestial diplomatic coup. This wasn't just theological innovation, it was geopolitical genius. By merging the storm god Teshub with the Hurrian Teshub and positioning herself as high priestess of both, she gave Anatolia's diverse subjects a shared divine language. Excavations at Ugarit uncovered temple inventories showing a sudden influx of Hittite-style ritual objects precisely during her tenure, proof her syncretism reached far beyond the capital. But Pujuhepa's true power lay in her mastery of the unseen. When Hattusili's rivals threatened rebellion, she didn't send soldiers, she dispatched clay figurines. Archaeologists at Kusakli found a trove of these eerie artifacts, tiny bound prisoners with their names inscribed on lead strips, buried beneath the palace gates where footsteps would eternally crush them. Even more chilling are the mouth-opening tablets from Kizzuwatna, detailing how she ritually killed effigies of opponents by pouring molten copper down their throats, then resurrected them as loyal vassals through incantations. Letters from terrified nobles beg for these curses to be lifted, offering tribute in exchange for their names being plucked from the underworld's ledger. The couple's most enduring legacy was their invention of dynastic destiny. Previous kings claimed temporary divine favor, but Hattusili and Pujuhepa wove an unbreakable myth around their bloodline. During their joint coronation at Nerik, priests buried a living tree entwined with iron bands beneath the temple, a living contract with the gods promising eternal rule to their descendants. When their son Tudhaliya later faced revolt, Pujuhepa didn't just rally troops. She staged a public ritual where the tree was unearthed, its thriving growth proclaimed as proof of celestial backing. The rebellion collapsed within weeks, its leaders reportedly deserting after nightmares of roots strangling them in their sleep. Foreign courts quickly learned not to underestimate this priestess queen. Her correspondence with Ramses II of Egypt reads like a diplomatic duel wrapped in silk. When the pharaoh proposed marrying one of her daughters, Pujuhepa didn't just negotiate terms. She sent a list of required rituals to purify his royal bedchamber for a child of the storm gods. The final treaty included an unprecedented clause. Any Egyptian official disrespecting the Hittite princess would be given to Hebat's bees, a reference to the deadly swarms kept in Pujuhepa's temples. Even age couldn't diminish her influence. In her later years, Pujuhepa compiled a sprawling book of dream interpretations, its surviving fragments revealing a mind equally at home with battlefield logistics and celestial symbolism. One passage explains how visions of flooded rivers could predict both harvest yields and troop movements, while another decodes the appearance of hawks in dreams as omens of Assyrian spies. Modern psychologists marvel at its blend of intuition and cold pragmatism, a reminder that for Pujuhepa, the divine and the tactical were never truly separate. Hattusili's death should have ended their era, but Pujuhepa refused to fade into widowhood. She ruled alongside Tudhaliya for a decade, her authority unchallenged because she'd spent a lifetime ensuring no one could imagine Hatti without her. When she finally joined her husband in the afterlife, the empire mourned not just a queen, but a living bridge between earth and heaven. Centuries later, Roman travelers in Anatolia would report locals still leaving honey cakes at roadside shrines inscribed with her name, a sweet tribute to the woman who proved that in the right hands, even the softest whispers could shake thrones. Tudhaliya IV didn't just rule an empire, he rewrote the skyline of history itself, leaving behind monuments so audacious they blurred the line between architecture and prophecy. Imagine a king who didn't merely restore temples but designed them as bridges to the divine, their very stones aligned with celestial movements. This was the ruler who inherited a Hittite realm already fraying at the edges, yet responded not with cautious retreat, but with a building spree that screamed to the heavens, "We are still here." His legacy pulses through the ruins of Hattusa, where every rebuilt wall and realigned gateway whispers of a monarch who believed his hands were guided by the gods themselves. Start with Yazilikaya, the bewildering open-air sanctuary that remains archaeology's greatest riddle. Unlike any other Hittite site, its rock-cut chambers feature a procession of deities frozen mid-stride, 94 figures marching across limestone walls in eerie silence. But Tudhaliya didn't just carve these gods, he choreographed them. Recent LiDAR scans reveal the procession aligns precisely with solstice sunlight, so that at high noon on Midsummer's Day, beams strike the storm god Teshub's image like a spotlight. Even more haunting is the Chamber of the Underworld, a hidden alcove where Tudhaliya's personal seal was found beside an empty throne carved directly into the rock. Was this a stage for sacred dramas or something far stranger? A fragmented priestly manual describes rites where the king would sit in darkness for 3 days, emerging to deliver words from beyond the veil. His architectural ambitions weren't confined to the mystical. Tudhaliya transformed Hattusa into a cosmic diagram, rebuilding its walls in concentric rings mirroring the threefold heavens described in Hittite hymns. The city's new gates weren't just defensive, they were celestial waypoints. The Lion Gate's beasts faced the rising sun of the spring equinox, while the Sphinx Gate's guardians aligned with Sirius, the dog star sacred to healing goddesses. Excavations uncovered foundation deposits beneath these structures, silver tablets inscribed with Tudhaliya's prayers, buried alongside meteorite fragments, literal pieces of the divine. What set Tudhaliya apart was his insistence that these projects weren't just pious gestures, but direct collaborations with deities. Tablets from his reign describe nightly design consultations where the storm god supposedly dictated measurements in cubits of lightning. One account claims Teshub guided the king's hand to sketch a revolutionary vaulted arch, a structural innovation centuries ahead of its time. Skeptics might dismiss this as royal propaganda, but the archaeology raises eyebrows. At the temple of the storm god, workers left graffiti complaining about the king's impossible angles, yet the building stands perfectly balanced even after 3 millennia. The darkest enigma lurks in Tudhaliya's final project, the Silent Gate at Hattusa's western edge. Unlike the city's other grand entrances, this one was deliberately unfinished, its threshold blocks bearing chisel marks where masons abruptly stopped work. Nearby tablets speak of a great voice from the earth forbidding completion, followed by Tudhaliya's cryptic decree that the gate must remain open for those who walk unseen. Some scholars interpret this as political turmoil interrupting construction, but folk legends tell a spookier tale. Even today, Anatolian shepherds avoid the spot at twilight, insisting shadows move there without bodies to cast them. Tudhaliya's end was as dramatic as his visions. After 25 years of cosmic masonry, he vanished during a pilgrimage to Mount Harhana, the storm god's mythical home. Search parties found only his iron crown resting on a volcanic outcrop, still warm to the touch. Later kings would claim he'd been taken into the clouds, but the truth is likely simpler and sadder. Skeletal remains near the summit, buried beneath a cairn with a mason's tools, hint at a more mortal farewell. Yet in a way, Tudhaliya achieved immortality. His buildings outlived empires, his sanctuaries still marking time with the sun long after Hattusa's fall. The last great king proved that stones could speak if you knew how to listen. The heavens themselves seemed to turn against Tudhaliya IV in his final years, when a total solar eclipse blotted out the midday sun over Hattusa, an event so terrifying, scribes described it as the gods closing their eyes upon the land. This wasn't just a celestial oddity, it was a direct challenge to a king who'd staked his reign on cosmic alignment. Clay tablets from the imperial archives preserve the frantic hours that followed, priests scrambling to interpret liver omens, astronomers tracing shadow patterns on wet clay, and Tudhaliya himself ascending the palace rooftop in full ritual regalia, his gold and lapis crown meant to call back the light. What makes this moment so pivotal isn't just the panic it sparked, but how it revealed the cracks in Tudhaliya's grand celestial bargain, the uneasy truth that even a god-king couldn't control the sky. The rituals enacted that day were unlike anything in Hittite records. At the storm god's temple, priests sacrificed 7 white bulls, one for each major deity, while chanting a newly composed hymn pleading for the sun's return. But the most chilling ceremony unfolded at Yazilikaya, where Tudhaliya ordered the carving of an impromptu addition to the sacred procession, a skeletal figure clutching a darkened solar disk. Archaeologists found flecks of gold leaf still clinging to this relief, evidence that priests attempted to restore the sun's light by gilding the stone. Meanwhile, commoners across the empire participated in a mandatory reverse festival, extinguishing all fires and donning upside-down clothing to symbolically undo the cosmic disorder. A merchant's letter from Kanish complains of being fined for lighting an oven during the darkness, proving these weren't empty gestures but state-enforced acts of desperation. What transformed this eclipse from temporary crisis to omen of doom was its timing. The darkness fell precisely as Assyrian forces massed on the eastern frontier, their ambassadors reportedly mocking Hittite envoys about their gods abandoning them. Tudhaliya's response, a lavish recoronation ceremony where he donned a new crown forged from meteoritic iron, only deepened the unease. Where earlier kings might have mustered armies, he doubled down on symbolism, as if believing ritual alone could shore up his fraying legitimacy. The gamble failed miserably. Within months, provincial governors began withholding troops, their loyalty wavering as whispers spread that the eclipse had been Teshub's verdict against the king's hubris. The deeper tragedy lies in how Tudhaliya's greatest strength became his fatal blind spot. His life's work aligning earthly power with celestial order collapsed under the weight of its own mysticism. Administrative tablets from his final years show a stark shift. Where once he dictated temple dimensions based on divine visions, now he obsessively recorded every bird flight and cloud formation as potential messages. A heartbreaking fragment from his personal scribe describes the king spending nights tracing star patterns on the floor with his scepter, muttering, "Show me where I erred." Archaeology confirms the eclipse's long shadow. Sediment cores from Hattusa's granaries show a sudden drop in stored grain afterward, suggesting diverted resources to appease the gods. Even more telling are the dozens of foundation deposits dug up and reburied across the city, ritual resets meant to cleanse tainted ground. But the most haunting artifact sits in Ankara's Museum of Anatolian Civilizations, Tudhaliya's eclipse tablet, its edges worn smooth from being handled by generations of later Hittite rulers. Each subsequent king would touch it before their coronation, a tangible reminder that divine favor was fleeting, and the sky could betray even its most devoted student. The empire never fully recovered its confidence after that day. Like a tree struck by lightning, it stood for decades more, but the heartwood had already begun to rot. Anuwanda III ascended the throne under skies heavy with ill omens, a king fated to rule an empire already slipping through his fingers like sand. The very currents of history seemed to turn against him from the start. Crops withered unseasonably, sacred springs ran dry, and Assyrian scouts crept ever closer to the crumbling frontier. But the most chilling warning came not from enemy camps but from his own priests. During his coronation at Yazilikaya, the sacred spring beneath the sanctuary, which had bubbled ceaselessly for centuries, fell suddenly silent as he placed the crown upon his head. The diviners didn't need entrails to interpret that omen. Their tablets from that day bear one stark phrase: the gods hold their breath. What followed was a reign defined by desperate gambles against inevitability. Faced with food shortages, Anuanda ordered grain shipments from Egypt only for the ships to sink in a storm off Cyprus, their cargoes washing ashore stamped with his royal seal as if the sea itself rejected his plea. When the Cascons rebelled in the north, his generals advised overwhelming force, but the king chose diplomacy, marrying his sister to their chieftain's son. The move bought temporary peace, but court scribes noted the princess's dowry included sacred statues of the storm god, an unthinkable concession that left Hattus's temples feeling hollow. The supernatural warnings grew impossible to ignore. At the annual Festival of the Dead, priests channeling Anuanda's ancestors reportedly vomited black bile mid-ritual, their trance voices whispering of a broken scepter in the west. Then came the dream that haunted the king's final months, a vision of Hattus's gates standing wide open, unmanned, while jackals trotted through the streets carrying human bones in their jaws. His terrified scribes recorded every detail, even noting how the dream recurred whenever Mars hovered near the constellation Scorpio, a celestial alignment the Assyrians revered as auspicious for conquest. His death remains one of antiquity's unsolved mysteries. The official account claims he succumbed to a fever after inspecting frontier forts, but a cache of letters from the Assyrian court tells a darker tale. Their spies reported seeing the Hittite king, struck by invisible arrows during a parley, collapsing as his bodyguards fled from, and this is the chilling detail: shadows that moved against the wind. Back in Hattusa, Anuanda's empty chariot returned at dusk, its reins slashed and wheels caked with mud from mountain passes no messenger could explain. The artifacts left behind paint a portrait of a ruler straining against fate. Archaeologists found his personal seal buried beneath the storm god's altar, its surface worn thin from constant handling. At Hakpi's, workers uncovered a hidden chamber where astrologers had charted the king's birth stars on the ceiling in silver and lapis, an attempt perhaps to literally rewrite his destiny. Most haunting is the unfinished treaty tablet from his final week, its edges still soft from the scribe's fingers, bearing the first words of what might have been a last-ditch alliance, if the sun should vanish from the sky. Anuanda's legacy is the weight of what almost was. His reign lasted barely 5 years, yet in that time he tried everything: diplomacy, divine appeals, even sending his own bloodline into enemy camps as collateral. Later generations would call him the king who fought the tide, a cautionary tale about the limits of mortal will. But walk the ruins of Hattus's final days, and you'll find his name scratched onto bricks by ordinary citizens, not curses but pleas. In the end, even as the empire crumbled around them, they remembered the ruler who refused to stop believing it could be saved. Suppiluliuma II gripped the throne of a dying empire, a king ruling over shadows where once there had been sunlit glory. By the time this last Hittite monarch took power around 1200 before the Common Era, the world around him was unraveling. The Assyrians pressed from the east, famine tightened its grip on the heartlands, and whispers of rebellion slithered through the court like serpents. Yet what makes Suppiluliuma's reign so haunting isn't just the collapse he presided over, but the frantic, almost poetic attempts to stop it. A ruler scribbling prayers onto clay as the walls crumbled around him. The most telling artifacts from his reign aren't victory stelae or tribute lists, but a cache of distress signals disguised as religious tablets. At the ruins of Hattusa, archaeologists found a series of desperate pleas to the storm god Teshub, each more anguished than the last. One, baked black as if fired in urgency, begs the deity to hold back the venomous tongues of traitors within the palace. Another, its edges cracked from repeated handling, describes a nightmare where the king watched his own crown melt into the Euphrates. These weren't formal state documents. They were raw, unfiltered cries for help, etched in cuneiform by shaking hands. The sheer intimacy of these texts chills the blood. Here was a man who knew the end was coming, yet refused to stop bargaining with the divine. His military campaigns read like a ghost's last stand. Fragmentary records mention a naval victory off the coast of Cyprus, a triumph so incongruous with the empire's landlocked heritage that some scholars speculate it was a doomed bid to secure grain routes. Excavations at Ugarit uncovered a letter from Suppiluliuma I demanding ships and sailors, its tone shifting abruptly from royal command to near plea. Send them before the moon finishes its cycle, or all will be lost. But the darkest clue lies in the soil itself. Sediment cores from Hattus's granaries show layers of charred barley dating to his reign, evidence that even as Suppiluliuma fought abroad, his capital was burning from within. Then comes history's most tantalizing silence, the abandonment of Hattusa. Unlike other ancient cities sacked by invaders, the Hittite capital shows no signs of mass slaughter or conquest. The palace archives were carefully packed away, their tablets sorted and sealed. The great temples were stripped of idols, not desecrated. Even the city's famous gates stood undamaged, as if one day everyone simply walked away. Suppiluliuma's final known decree only deepens the mystery. A broken tablet found near the Sphinx gate orders the sacred guardians to seal the doors and take the keys to the gods. Was this a strategic evacuation, a religious exodus, or something stranger still? Modern theories spiral in all directions. Some blame climate change. Tree rings from the era reveal years of drought that could have shattered the empire's agricultural backbone. Others point to a mysterious wave of migrations called the Bronze Age collapse, where entire civilizations from Greece to Mesopotamia crumbled like dominoes. But the most haunting possibility comes from a single clay label found in the ruins, bearing Suppiluliuma's seal and 3 cryptic words: "The gods withdrew." Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between earthquake and omen. In the last days, Suppiluliuma seems to have become both king and high priest of a dying cult, staging ever more elaborate rituals to summon divine intervention. At Yazilikaya, workers discovered an altar smeared with an unnatural metallic substance. Analysis revealed it to be electrum mixed with human tears, likely shed during some final, desperate ceremony. The last tangible trace of his reign, a child's doll found near the palace, its baked clay face upturned as if watching the skies, still clutched in the skeletal fingers of the one who'd held it when the end came. In the end, Suppiluliuma II vanishes from history as abruptly as his capital, leaving behind no tomb, no grand epitaph, just empty streets where the wind still whispers through limestone gates, and the unanswered question of whether an empire falls when its enemies strike or when its gods turn their backs. The collapse of the Hittite Empire wasn't a single dramatic explosion, it was a slow fade, a dimming of light punctuated by the shadowy reigns of kings whose names barely survive in fragments of clay and whispers of myth. These were rulers without grand monuments, without vast archives to proclaim their deeds, yet their stories pulse with a haunting intensity precisely because they stand on the crumbling edge of history. Among them, the most enigmatic is Tudhaliya the Younger, a figure mentioned only in a single broken tablet from Hattus's ruins. The text describes him as the king who walked backward, a cryptic phrase that sparked endless debate. Some scholars interpret it as political symbolism, a ruler trying to reverse Hatti's decline, while others point to a burial site near Alakahyuk where a skeleton was found facing the opposite direction of traditional Hittite interments, its hands clutching a rusted iron key. Was this Tudhaliya? The key fits no known lock in the capital, leaving us to wonder what door, real or metaphorical, he hoped to unlock as his world fell apart. Equally mysterious is the Queen of Ashes, a title scrawled on a fire-blackened vase discovered in the ruins of Tahantasa. The vessel's inscriptions tell of a royal woman who ruled for mere months after her husband's death, presiding over a court where the bread was mixed with dust and the wine with tears. Local legends speak of her dancing atop the city walls as invaders approached, her robes sewn with gold threads that caught the setting sun, buying time for the last civilians to flee through underground tunnels. Archaeology lends eerie support to this tale. Recent ground-penetrating radar revealed an intricate network of escape routes beneath the city, their entrances deliberately collapsed from within. Even her name is lost, only the epithet remains, a testament to leadership measured in sacrifices rather than years. Then there's the case of the Shadow King, known only from cursed tablets found buried beneath Assyrian military camps. These lead scrolls, inscribed with Hittite hieroglyphs, threaten vengeance upon the usurper who wears the stolen crown. Assyrian records from the same period mention defeating a Hittite warlord named Kuranta, but the descriptions don't match any known ruler from the official king lists. The truth might lie in a vandalized relief at Carchemish, where a figure's face has been chiseled away, leaving only the outline of a distinctive spiked crown, a style worn exclusively by Hittite royalty in their final decades. Was this the face of Kuranta, a survivor king ruling a rump state in the empire's corpse, his memory deliberately erased by conquerors? The most chilling clues come not from grand palaces but from humble places. A potter's workshop in Calais Teep yielded a bowl inscribed with a child's shaky handwriting. Father says the king is dead, but the men from the mountains say he walks at night. Beneath these words, archaeologists found a tiny clay figurine, a horned god with its head snapped off, wrapped in a scrap of gold foil. It's a poignant reminder that for ordinary people living through the collapse, the disappearance of their rulers wasn't just political, it was cosmic, a severing of the bond between earth and heaven. These lost kings and queens haunt us because they defy categorization. They weren't the architects of glory like Suppiluliuma I, nor the tragic last defenders like Ammuna. They were the rulers of the in-between, the twilight sovereigns who held the crown as the lights went out, their reigns measured not in monuments but in the desperate choices of those who know they're writing the last page. Their legacy isn't in what they built, but in what they couldn't stop from crumbling, and in the fragile humanity that lingers in their scattered traces, like fingerprints on the edge of a broken vase. The Hittites didn't just bury their dead kings, they invited them to dinner. Across Anatolia, clay tablets and temple reliefs reveal a startling belief. Departed rulers didn't fade into the underworld but took their seats among the gods, wielding power that could shape harvests, battles, and even the dreams of the living. This wasn't mere ancestor worship, it was a full-scale celestial bureaucracy where the deceased monarchs became intermediaries between heaven and earth, their whims as consequential as any divine decree. Take the Feast of the Shades, an annual ritual where the living and dead royalty broke bread together. At Hattusili's stone house temple, priests would lay out golden platters heaped with honey cakes and roasted lamb, meals identical to those served in the palace, while chanting invitations to specific kings by name. Archaeologists found one such menu scraped onto a tablet, detailing how Telipinu IV preferred his meat well charred, as in life, while Suppiluliuma I's portion required extra garlic, a flavor his ghost allegedly favored. But this was no empty gesture. Oracle texts show these meals had stakes. If a dead king's portion went untouched by morning, no easy feat in a temple full of rodents, priests interpreted it as celestial disapproval, often triggering emergency reforms. The deification process itself was a marvel of spiritual engineering. When a Hittite king died, his successor didn't just mourn, he orchestrated a metaphysical promotion. At Yazilikaya, newly deciphered inscriptions describe a 40-day ceremony where the deceased ruler's essence was transferred into a statue of the storm god, their mortal flaws ritually burned away in stages. First, their heart was symbolically replaced with lapis lazuli for wisdom, then their bones coated in electrum for immortality, until finally their name was etched into the scroll of the 1,000 gods. Excavations at Labarna I uncovered one such statue base with a hollow compartment. Inside lay a crumbling scrap of cloth stained with myrrh and something darker, possibly royal blood, the physical anchor for a king's transformed spirit. These deified monarchs weren't distant deities, they were active participants in Hittite governance. A treaty tablet from Ugarit records how Suppiluliuma I's ghost allegedly appeared to a vassal king in a dream, threatening to dry up the rivers if tribute wasn't paid. More chilling are the curse conduits, terracotta pipes found buried beneath city gates where commoners could slip in written pleas or accusations directly to the royal dead. One such note, preserved in clay, begs Annuanda's spirit to punish a corrupt tax collector. Let his wife's womb wither as the reed fields did in your time. The sheer specificity suggests petitioners believed these kings retained their earthly personalities and grudges. The darkest evidence comes from the ordeal pits of Nerek. Here, suspected traitors were forced to spend a night surrounded by statues of deified kings, holding a copper rod said to channel their judgment. Tablet fragments describe how the accused would emerge either exonerated or mad, babbling about the iron voices of dead rulers. Modern excavations revealed these pits weren't mere theatrics. They contained high concentrations of naturally occurring hallucinogenic gases, meaning subjects genuinely experienced visions. Whether by accident or design, the Hittites had created a supernatural justice system where the dead literally spoke. Even conquest couldn't break these bonds. When Assyrian forces eventually sacked Hittite cities, they were baffled to find locals smuggling not gold or weapons, but small effigies of dead kings. One surviving captive's account explains, without them, the land forgets how to breathe. Centuries later, Roman travelers in Anatolia reported villages still leaving offerings at ruined Hittite tombs, proof that some ghosts refused to fade, especially when they once wore crowns. The deified kings may have outlived their empire, lingering in the twilight between memory and myth, still holding court in the imaginations of those who came after. History remembers the Hittite kings, but their queens were the hidden architects of power, weaving divine authority and earthly diplomacy into an unbreakable web. While their husbands led armies, these women ruled from the temples, their authority drawn not from the sword but from the whispered words of rituals older than Hattusili itself. Take Pujuhepa, the hurricane in priestess's robes, who didn't just advise her king but dictated terms to pharaohs. A single letter she sent to Ramses II still survives, its tone oscillating between velvet diplomacy and velvet-wrapped threat. You ask for my daughter's hand, yet your envoys arrive bearing less gold than my stable masters wear in their hair. The storm gods do not look kindly upon petty men. The queen's true power lay in their mastery of the Tablet of the 1,000 Words, a collection of spells so potent they were locked in a cedar box bound with iron chains. Excavations at the ruins of Samu have uncovered fragments of these incantations, not the generic pleas of common priests, but shockingly specific commands. One tablet orders the moon to darken for 3 nights over an enemy's camp, coinciding exactly with Assyrian records of a failed invasion thwarted by inexplicable darkness. Another, written in Queen Danuhepa's distinctive angular script, threatens to unravel the breath from any noble who plotted against her husband, invoking a demoness who sews lips with threads of burning bronze. Their authority extended beyond mere cursed tablets. Hittite queens served as chief interpreters of dreams, a role far more political than mystical. When a merchant's daughter dreamed of snakes swallowing the sun, Queen Gashulawiya didn't just see an omen. She recognized a brewing revolt among the northern copper miners who used serpent motifs. Her intervention diverted a grain shipment to their region, soothing discontent before it could ignite. This wasn't intuition. It was an information network woven through temple acolytes, midwives, and market inspectors who reported unusual rumors directly to the royal women's quarters. The most fascinating evidence of their clout lies buried beneath Hattusili's gates. Archaeologists found lead figurines of queens alongside kings in foundation deposits, their faces deliberately smeared with honey, a sacred material believed to sweeten the god's disposition. But the real revelation came when linguists deciphered the accompanying inscriptions. Where kings were described as beloved of Teshub, the queens bore the terrifying title, she who stands between, implying they could intercept divine wrath before it struck the kingdom. A smashed tablet from the palace archives hints at how this worked. During a solar eclipse, Queen Tawananna was said to have averted disaster by scattering ground lapis lazuli into a ritual fire, creating smoke so blue it fooled the sky into thinking dawn had come. Their legacy survives in the unlikeliest places. Modern excavations at Alalak uncovered a Hittite queen's seal stamped on a beer jug, not some ceremonial vessel, but ordinary tavern ware. The message was clear. Even in the lowest tavern, her influence flowed like the drink itself, and perhaps that's the ultimate testament to their power. Long after the last Hittite king's name faded from memory, Anatolian grandmothers still told tales of the lion women who ruled from the shadows, their prayers sharper than any sword. The whispers began in the temple archives, clay tablets etched with warnings so dire, scribes hesitated to transcribe them. In the waning years of the Hittite Empire, as Assyrian shadows lengthened across the borders, a succession of seers delivered prophecies that didn't just predict hardship but orchestrated doom. Among them, a blind oracle from the city of Samuha stood apart, her visions transcribed onto silver foil to preserve their terrible brightness. One such fragment, discovered in a sealed jar beneath Hattusili's gates, described a great hunger that walks on bronze legs, devouring grain stores before the harvest. Within a decade, climate data from tree rings would confirm the worst drought in 5 centuries, just as she foretold. But the darkest prophecy came from a royal astrologer named Zidi, whose celestial charts mapped catastrophe. On a tablet now housed in the Louvre, his calculations showed Saturn and Mars aligning over the constellation of the Crow, a configuration he called the breath of the dying empire. The timing was uncanny. That very year, Assyrian records note a mysterious blight withering Hittite orchards, while letters from Ugarit describe merchant ships arriving with holds full of worm-ridden grain. Zidi's final warning, scrawled in haste before his disappearance, claimed the gods had shown him Hattusili's gates, standing open like a dead man's mouth, guarded only by wind and ghosts. The most chilling parallel emerges from the dream of the broken scepter, recounted by a palace scribe during King Anuwanda's reign. A nameless priestess dreamed of the royal insignia splintering into 3 pieces, each consumed by different beasts, a lion Assyria, a vulture famine, and a serpent betrayal from within. When archaeologists pieced together administrative records from the empire's final years, they found a grim trifecta: Assyrian incursions, crop failures, and clay tablets revealing provincial governors hoarding troops while pleading for aid. A priestess's vision had mapped the empire's collapse with terrifying precision. Yet the prophecies weren't passive predictions, they became self-fulfilling weapons. When the seer Poa proclaimed that kings would drown in their own blood, panicked nobles began defecting, convinced the throne was cursed. A cache of letters from Carchemish reveals how one governor secretly negotiated with Assyria, citing Poa's words as justification. Why cling to a house already burning? Even nature seemed to conspire. A solar eclipse mentioned in the Black Clay Chronicles coincided with the defection of key allies, its darkness interpreted as the gods turning their backs. The final act played out in eerie silence. Unlike the dramatic sackings of other Bronze Age capitals, Hattusili's abandonment felt like a ritual surrender to fate. The last prophecy tablets were carefully buried, not destroyed, as if meant to be found. One, broken but legible, bears the words, "When the storm god departs, take only his silence as your answer." Walking those empty streets today, you can almost hear the echo of those lost voices, not in triumph or despair, but in grim resignation, as if the Hittites hadn't fallen to invaders, but to the weight of their own foresight. The prophecies didn't just foresee the end, they became the script the empire followed into the dark. Deep beneath the ruins of Hattusili's temples, archaeologists keep uncovering objects that make even seasoned researchers hesitate, artifacts so steeped in ancient dread that local workers still whisper warnings before touching them. These aren't just relics, they're vessels of stories that blur the line between history and horror, where the fingerprints of long-dead kings seem to linger like curses carved in clay. Take the infamous Dagger of Silent Screams, excavated from the tomb of a minor Hittite prince but linked by inscriptions to King Mursili II. The blade's bronze surface bears eerie grooves that emit a whistling sound when swung, a phenomenon scientists attribute to precise metalwork, but which Hittite texts describe as the voices of those it slain, trapped forever in the metal. When the dagger was first displayed in Ankara's museum, 3 separate night guards reported hearing faint cries near its case, forcing curators to move it to a soundproof room. Then there's the Mirror of the Sun Goddess, a disc of polished obsidian discovered beneath the foundations of Arena's temple, its edges inscribed with a warning: "He who sees his reflection here shall lose his shadow to the underworld." Legend claims it was used by Queen Pujuhepa to commune with the dead, but modern tests revealed something stranger. The mirror's volcanic glass contains magnetite deposits that subtly distort reflections, making faces appear elongated or even skull-like under certain light. Workers at the dig site refused to look directly into it, insisting their peripheral visions caught movements in the black glass that vanished when they turned to look. The most chilling discoveries are the contract tablets, not treaties, but agreements between kings and the supernatural. One such tablet from Suppiluliuma I's reign details a pact with the storm god Teshub, victory in battle in exchange for the firstborn sons of 7 cities. While scholars debate whether this was literal or symbolic, excavations at the mentioned cities show mass child graves dating precisely to his campaigns. Even more unsettling is the clay envelope containing this tablet. When opened in 2019, conservators found the interior coated in a reddish residue that DNA analysis revealed to be a mix of human blood and royal beeswax. Modern technology has only deepened these mysteries. When researchers used CT scans on a seemingly ordinary Hittite ceremonial mace, they discovered its hollow core contained 7 iron nails arranged in a spiral, an exact match to curse descriptions in Hittite anti-witchcraft texts. The nails bore microscopic traces of nerve toxin, suggesting the weapon wasn't just symbolic but designed to deliver slow paralysis. But the real shock came when infrared photography revealed invisible fingerprints on the mace's handle, fingerprints that matched the handprint of King Hattusili III, preserved on a clay tablet from his personal archive. Perhaps no artifact embodies this supernatural dread better than the Crown of Falling Stars, a silver diadem recovered from a collapsed shrine near Tahentasa. Its 12 points each hold a cavity that once housed meteorite fragments, chunks of celestial iron the Hittites believed contained the souls of deified kings. Laboratory tests confirmed the metal's extraterrestrial origin, but also something inexplicable. The fragments emit faint electromagnetic pulses at irregular intervals, strong enough to disrupt recording equipment. Workers at the excavation reported vivid, identical dreams of a faceless king standing at the foot of their beds whenever the crown was kept on-site overnight. The irony is that science often explains these phenomena: the dagger's sound waves, the mirror's optical tricks, the crown's radioactive minerals, yet the artifacts retain their power. When the Berlin Museum returned a collection of Hittite curse tablets to Turkey in 2021, the cargo plane encountered such severe turbulence that the pilot aborted landing twice. Coincidence, perhaps, but as one archaeologist noted while sealing away the Dagger of Silent Screams for the night, 3,000 years ago, someone believed words could trap a soul in metal. Who's to say they were wrong? The Hittite kings didn't just rule with the gods' favor, they claimed to carry divine blood in their veins, a lineage stretching back to the storm god Teshub himself. This wasn't mere propaganda, it was the bedrock of their authority, a sacred contract etched into every royal decree and battle standard. The king's supposed divinity wasn't some vague, distant connection. It was proven through rituals so visceral, they blurred the line between coronation and apotheosis. Take the infamous Bridal of the Gods ceremony, where new rulers underwent a symbolic marriage to the sun goddess Arina. Clay tablets from Hattusa describe how the king would don a robe woven with gold threads to mimic sunlight, then consume a ritual meal of honey and pomegranate seeds, food reserved for deities, while priests chanted, "Today you are no longer of earth but of sky." But bloodlines required constant validation. Every autumn at the festival of Puruli, the king would reenact Teshub's mythical victory over the serpent Ilianka, donning a scaled cuirass and wielding a silver axe. The performance wasn't theater, it was a metaphysical necessity. If the king faltered or the crowd's cheers diminished, scribes noted it as a bad omen, a sign the divine connection was fraying. Excavations at Alakahayuk revealed a hidden chamber beneath the temple of Nerik containing rows of clay figurines, each representing a king who'd failed this cosmic test. Their heads had been ritually broken, their names scraped from official records. The message was clear: divinity wasn't inherited, it was earned daily. The most chilling evidence of this divine claim lies in the blood oaths sworn by vassals. Unlike other empires demanding loyalty to the crown, Hittite treaties invoked the king's very biology. A surviving pact with the Hyassa people warns that betrayers would drink the king's blood in the afterlife, referencing a ceremony where subjects sipped wine mixed with a drop of royal blood from a ceremonial dagger. Modern DNA analysis of residue on one such blade found traces of hemochromatosis, a hereditary iron overload disorder suggesting that divine blood may have had a literal, unnatural tint. Yet this divine status came with terrifying responsibility. When drought or plague struck, the king didn't just petition the gods, he became the sacrificial intermediary. The ritual of the substitute king describes how the ruler would publicly don rags and chains, allowing priests to whip his legs with reed stalks while chanting, "Let the gods' wrath break upon this body, not the land." At Yazilikaya, archaeologists found a limestone block with grooves designed to channel liquids, likely the blood of kings who took this duty too literally. The legacy of this divine bloodline outlasted the empire itself. Centuries after Hattusa's fall, Roman historians recorded Anatolian tribes still practicing king-making rituals involving meteorite iron, believing the metal carried fragments of the Hittite gods. Even today, a genetic study of families near ancient Hittite holy sites revealed an unusually high incidence of that same hemochromatosis mutation, a silent, stubborn echo of rulers who insisted they were more than human. Their power may have crumbled, but their blood still whispers through the ages. The Hittite kings didn't just vanish with their empire, they melted into legend. Their deeds distilled into tales whispered across campfires and carved into the bedrock of civilizations that followed. Their stories took on lives of their own, morphing from historical record into something far more potent, myth. In the rugged highlands of Anatolia, where Hattusa's ruins crumble beneath the stars, local shepherds still recount stories of a thundering king buried beneath Mount Zalianu, waiting to awaken when invaders threaten the land. These aren't just folk tales, they're echoes of Tudhaliya IV's final prophecy, warped by time but still pulsing with his unshakable belief in divine return. The Hittites' influence bled into the DNA of later cultures in ways both obvious and subliminal. When the Phrygians rose to power in the vacuum left by Hattusa's fall, they adopted and adapted the Hittite royal rituals. Excavations at Gordion revealed a Phrygian king buried with a ceremonial iron axe nearly identical to those wielded by Hittite storm priests, its blade etched with a modified version of Teshub's lightning bolt symbol. Even the Greeks, who later colonized Anatolia's coasts, wove Hittite threads into their own myths. Scholars now believe the legend of King Midas, the monarch whose touch turned objects to gold, may trace back to distorted memories of Hittite prosperity rituals, where kings draped themselves in electrum during solstice ceremonies to draw wealth from the sun. But the Hittites' most enduring export wasn't gold or gods. It was the very idea of divine kingship as a cosmic contract. Assyrian rulers copied their treaty formats verbatim, right down to the celestial curses. Persian emperors staged coronations at sacred mountains, mirroring the Hittite bond between throne and summit. And centuries later, when Roman generals marched through Anatolia, they puzzled over local guides refusing to disturb certain ruins, muttering about old ghosts who charge interest on stolen stones. These weren't idle superstitions, they were the last reverberations of a civilization that had convinced the world its kings walked with one foot in heaven. What makes these rulers so endlessly fascinating isn't just their forgotten empire, but the uncanny way their lives defy easy categorization. Were Hattusili's battlefield miracles clever tactics or divine intervention? Did Pujuhepa's curses shape history through magic or masterful psychology? The tablets leave just enough ambiguity to tantalize. Modern archaeologists still debate whether the lightning weapons described in Muwatalli's campaigns were metaphorical or early experiments with conductive metals, an ancient prototype of some lost technology. Perhaps the Hittites' greatest trick was making sure we'd never stop searching for them. Their libraries were carefully preserved even as their cities fell, their treaties buried like time capsules meant to be found. When early explorers first deciphered their cuneiform in the 19th century, they unlocked more than a dead language. They revived a conversation across 3,000 years. Today, as satellite imaging reveals undiscovered Hittite sites beneath Turkish farmlands and DNA analysis traces modern Anatolians back to Bronze Age subjects, we're still piecing together the full scope of their legacy. The truth is, we see the Hittite kings everywhere once we know to look. In the way storms still roll violently over the Anatolian plateau, their thunder sounding eerily like bronze drums. In the stubborn survival of certain rituals like hanging iron charms on newborn cradles to ward off evil, a practice that dates back to Suppiluliuma I's time. And in the quiet persistence of questions that defy answers, how much of history is fact and how much is the stories we need to believe? The Hittites understood that power lies not just in lands conquered, but in legends that outlast empires. They built their immortality not with stone but with mysteries and left us to unravel them. Centuries may have crumbled their palaces and erased their borders, but the stories of the Hittite kings still pulse with an energy that refuses to fade. Their tales of divine visions, cursed crowns, and battles waged under storm-filled skies aren't just relics of the past, they're mirrors held up to our own fascination with power, destiny, and the thin veil between the mortal and the divine. These rulers didn't merely command armies or build cities. They danced with gods, bargained with the unseen, and left behind mysteries that still tease the edges of our understanding. What makes their legacy endure isn't just the scale of their empire, but the audacity of their beliefs that a king could be more than a man, that a whisper from the heavens could shape history, and that even the mightiest throne was just one step away from the supernatural. Think about the echoes of their world in ours. When archaeologists unearth a Hittite treaty sealed with celestial curses, or a dagger said to trap the screams of the slain, we're not just studying history, we're confronting the universal human hunger for stories that defy explanation. The Hittites knew something we've never forgotten. The best tales aren't just told, they're felt. That's why their kings still haunt us, whether it's Suppiluliuma's plague-fueled downfall, Pujuhepa's dreams turned state policy, or Tudhaliya's monuments aligned with the stars. These narratives blur the line between chronicle and legend, leaving us to wonder where history ends and myth begins. So which of these rulers lingers in your imagination? Was it Mursili, the prayer king who shouted questions at the storm god? Or perhaps Hattusili, the usurper who wielded curses like a blade? Maybe it's the shadowy figures like Tudhelia the Younger, whose name survives only in fragments yet hints at untold dramas. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which king's story resonated with you and why. And if these glimpses into the Hittite world have left you hungry for more, you're in luck. History is brimming with civilizations just as enigmatic, from the oracle bones of the Shang dynasty to the labyrinthine legends of Minoan Crete. Hit that subscribe button to join me as we keep unraveling the past, one astonishing mystery at a time. After all, the Hittites remind us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the people who dared to believe they could touch the divine. And who knows, the next great discovery might be waiting just beneath the dust, ready to rewrite everything